welcome to PEEP, or Planet Extra Extra podcast. This is a new feature of PEP. It won't necessarily be every week, or maybe it will be. Let's see if you guys like it. This is where you can come for a bunch of stuff that I couldn't squeeze into the PEP podcast this week, plus also long-form interviews. That's new, with some really interesting people. Now, if you haven't finished PEP193 yet, you should do that and then come back here because we got a great interview today with one of my favourite journos, Radley Balko. But let's continue on from where we left off at the end of PEP193. I only got halfway through my Wildfires section in PEP193, so should we continue? Sorry, I forgot you can't talk to me because that's not how podcasts work. So I'm going to assume for now that you do want me to continue. Wildfires. Now, I have some updated numbers on the damage. 28 people have actually now been killed by the LA fires, and they've destroyed more than 15,000 homes, offices, and shops. Now, I spoke to you in PEP193 about two of the main reasons that people are being blamed for the fire: water access and forest management. Now, let's move to underfunding of the fire department. And this begins and ends with Karen Bass. A lot of attention on her. She cut funding for the LAFD, that's the fire department, by $17.6 million last year, which is 2% of their budget. Now, the right accused her of spending all her money on DEI, which is kind of ridiculous. DEI is a very small portion of the budget compared to all the rest of the fire budget. But they also accused her of giving fire resources to Ukraine instead. In fact, Alex Jones called it democratic treason. But the donations to Ukraine were actually in 2022, like a lot of American fire departments donated then. And what they all did was donate small amounts of retired surplus equipment, such as boots, hoses, nozzles, body armor, medication. It was a whole bunch of stuff that either they give to Ukraine or they throw out because it was no longer compatible with what they were using. So that's not a big deal. The left noted that Karen Bass increased police funding last year by $126 million in the same budget. And they're a bit angry about that. But look, regardless of the intricate spending in the LA budget, Bass did actually add an extra 4-year, $203 million contract in November with the firefighters union to help boost wages and health benefits for the staff. So that's $50 million a year more anyway. Although, to be fair, Karen Bass also apparently on January 6th demanded an extra $49 million of fire department cuts. So what you give with one hand, you take with the other. That was only like 2 days before the fire broke out. They would have had to shut down 16 fire stations to make that work. But the memo demanding cuts did say, quote, "The details of this plan have not yet been developed. This is a worst case scenario and it is not happening yet. The fire chief will have a chat with the chief webinar next week to clarify the situation and the budget." Look, either way, I'm not sure this made much of a huge difference to fighting this particular fire. This fire was going to be a doozy, whether they had an extra 17 million or not. Although the fire chief did give critics plenty of material.
But was the budget cut, Chief?
Yes, it was cut, and it did impact our ability to provide service.
What is your message to city administrators, starting with Mayor Bass?
My message is the fire department needs to be properly funded.
And it's not.
It's not at this point, and we've got the justification.
And the fire chief also wrote Bass a letter on December 4 saying that the budgeted reduction in overtime hours has, quote, severely limited the department's capacity to prepare for, train for, and respond to large-scale emergencies, including wildfires. So that isn't great. But that's Karen Bass's situation. Gavin Newsom, he also cut $101 million from the wildfire and forest resilience budget in 2024. Having said that, the experts still say they had plenty of resources. I mean, look, that wildfire and forest resilience budget has gone up by billions of dollars over the last few years for a start. But also, Michelle Steinberg, the wildfire division director at the National Fire Prevention Agency, said that the cities in California and the state itself have some of the best equipped, best trained and best experienced fire services that we have in the world. Ray Bazal, he's the director of regional operations for the NFPA, and he was in the fires. He said all the resources that were heading to the fire within the first hour were tremendous. Bulldozers, tenders, lots of fire engines and other vehicles. So look, maybe fire funding could have been better, but it was still excellent. So look, that's probably not the reason the fire got out of control. If we talk about leadership in general, that's another story. Karen Bass, you may have heard, was in Ghana when the fires broke out. You might be wondering why she'd be in Ghana. Well, the Biden administration sent her there. Geez, they kicked a lot of goals in the last few months. A few annoying things about Karen Bass being in Ghana, though. Number one, she told the New York Times in 2021 that she wouldn't travel internationally if she was elected. Yet she was in Ghana and she already visited the Paris Olympics 3 times. Now, I know LA is hosting the 2028 Olympics, but still, 3 times. It did raise eyebrows. 2, Karen Bass was warned by the National Weather Service before she left that there was an extreme wildfire risk. Now, I don't mean like jackass, extreme. I mean like don't leave for Ghana, extreme. But she went anyway. And 3, not only did Bass not take the threat seriously, but the LAFD didn't take the threat seriously either. They could have assigned emergency deployment for another 1,000 firefighters those days when the extreme wildfire risk was around. That they could have had more than 20 trucks ready instead of the 5 trucks they had ready before the fire started. Now, they considered doing that. They heard the National Weather Service warnings. They considered it, but they chose not to, presumably to save money, maybe because of the $17 million in cuts. I don't know. But that's annoying. And 4, Bass had no deputy minding the shop while she was away because Deputy Mayor Brian Williams was, wait for it, placed on leave after he was suspected of calling in a bomb threat against his own government. Now, that's a weird thing for a deputy mayor to do, to call in a bomb threat against their own government. It's a thing that kids do maybe before their maths exam, but it's not a thing a deputy mayor should do. But apparently he did, allegedly. Oh, and also 5, the guy they got to fill in for Bass while she was away, Acting Mayor Marquise Harris Dawson, took over 6 hours to declare an emergency after the fire started. Now, federal aid can't be deployed until the emergency is declared, so they didn't get the federal aid a little bit later after that. It basically couldn't come until the next day after the fire was out of control because they took too damn long to declare an emergency. So that's a whole bunch of annoying things because Karen Bass was in Ghana. Now, there is no suggestion that any of this made all the difference with the fire. The fire was still going to be a doozy regardless, but it might not have been quite as bad maybe. And look, either way, even if the fire had been exactly the same, that's quite a lot of terrible decisions being made, it has to be said. Also, Bass wasn't exactly inspiring when she returned either. This was her telling the victims of the fire where to go for help.
Right now, if you need help, emergency information, resources, and shelter is available. All of this can be found at URL.
Now, to be fair, I'm sure there is a URL where you can find that info, but you don't get the impression she's really paying much attention when she's reading, do you? Then there is the issue of DEI. Megyn Kelly said, what we're seeing was largely preventable. LA's fire chief has made not filling the fire hydrants top priority, but diversity. Now look, there's no evidence for this at all. We know why the fire hydrants were empty. I told you in PEP, it's because the water pressure ran out. All they're judging by, and also they have an old water system, which is not going to be easy to renovate. All they're judging by was a website where the fire chief, a web clip, where the fire chief said that she wanted to make the LAFD more diverse. That got sent around on Twitter. And the usual libs of TikTok, etc., just went crazy. Oh, diversity. But that doesn't prove anything. That they have some kind of, let's say it's stupid diversity pushes. Let's say it's management they don't need or courses they don't need. I don't know. All I'm saying is that's not the reason for the fire. That's it. Also, for those wondering, only 12 fireys were fired because of the vaccine mandate back in 2021. So don't even think of blaming that. Those have been long since replaced as well, those fireys. Look, there's an obvious truth why it's so bad. Every expert says the same thing. And Dave talked about it in PEP193. The 100 mile per hour Santa Ana winds. Strong, dry gusts from the inland. Now, I could quote endless experts saying, once you get a situation that dry and that windy, embers can blow for miles, and each ember can easily start a new blaze. Once the fire gets going, you can't control burn enough to stop it. There's always going to be too many demands on an antiquated water system. It would help if they tore out the entire water system of LA and started again, but that would be fantastically expensive. And it might not have stopped the fire anyway. We just don't know. It was a huge fire in perfect conditions. If this was a George Clooney movie, it would be the perfect fire. Add the Santa Ynez Reservoir situation, which we told you about in PEP 193, that the reservoir was empty. That reservoir might have bought you more time, but they were probably screwed anyway. The conditions made it extremely hard to stop a fire. That's why people were annoyed at Karen Bass for going to Ghana when she did, because the conditions were so bad. Is this all about climate change? Well, look, climate change certainly helped. The summer was the hottest summer for 130 years. There has been virtually no rain in the area since that hottest summer for 130 years. That's unusual. Over time, with climate change, there are greater swings between heavy rain, heavy drought. And that's exactly what we've seen in the last 12 months. Record rainfall in LA, producing more lush vegetation, record heat, and then record drought, drying it out. They're the perfect conditions for big fires. That's why this managed to happen in the depths of winter, which is also, by the way, a little unusual. But also, that's more reason to take every precaution. It's more reason to clear brush. It's more reason to build extra reservoirs. We saw a whole bunch of precautions they didn't take. I've just brought you through them. So I'm not saying they are perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not saying Karen Bass and Gavin Newsom are beyond criticism. I've just given you a bunch of them. I'm just saying they didn't start the fire. That's all I'm saying, okay? The fire was going to start anyway, and it was going to be bad. Maybe if everything went perfectly, they might have stopped it, but this is the real world. Not everything goes perfectly. Climate change, by the way, while it's an issue, I don't even think it's the main issue. And I know I'm about to, if security, I shouldn't have said that loud. Security ABC might toss me out for saying that. But you're not allowed to say that in the ABC. But look, climate change, I don't think is primarily responsible for this fire. Sure didn't help. But climate change isn't responsible for those winds. The Santa Ana winds are often there, and they've been there for a long time. Climate change is also not responsible for a key point about why this fire had to happen. If not now, soon. And that is the vegetation in LA. What I referred to in PEP 193, chaparral. Chaparral is all over LA. It's also in Australia, and it's also in South Africa and a bunch of other countries that have fires. It's very conducive to wildfires because it needs wildfire to reproduce. It's evolutionarily designed to reproduce in a state of wildfire, and so it's really easy to catch fire. It gets super dry over time, and over a cycle of 30 to 50 years or so, it desperately wants a wildfire to help germinate its seed. And when it does catch on fire, it's a huge fire. It wants that seed to go as far as possible. So every 30 to 40 years or so, LA has a massive fire. Even without climate change, even without Karen Bass, even without Ghana or torn covers on reservoirs, LA has a big fire every 30 to 40 years. It is really hard to stop this happening. It might not have happened this year, but then it would have happened next year or the year after. They were certainly due for a big fire around now. Now you might go, well, how about you just stop the fires from happening? Keep on putting it off. If you try to prevent these fires from happening, and by the way, I'm saying you should try to prevent it. I'm not saying you should just give up and just have matchboxes lying around everywhere and white phosphorus and just let it rip. Sure, try to minimize fires. Try to minimize the amount of fuel that's around. But if you do a great job of preventing these fires from happening, the longer you put them off, the bigger that fire becomes when it happens, because the chaparral's going to get drier and more ready to go. These plants are made to be burned. So, could I suggest I know the whole of LA are peppers, especially Karen Bass and Gavin Newsom. So, can I suggest to you guys one of two things? I'm talking off the top of my head here, okay? So this is probably bullshit. But it just strikes me that one thing you could do is you could replace the chaparral with some other kind of vegetation. Now, that's not going to be easy because that's naturally occurring vegetation. There's a lot of it. Okay, so that might be like, just change the whole water system. It might be too hard. But I wonder if people have explored that. Is it possible for there to be some other kind of vegetation that's planted where the chaparral is in that region that won't be so conducive to fires? I don't know. It's one option I would suggest exploring. But if it's not possible, and if that's ridiculous, then there is another option, which you can definitely do. And that is, rather than changing what's starting the fires, which is impossible, potentially if you can't change the vegetation, change what continues the fires. Change what makes the fires worse. And that is the city. If people are going to live, I'm not saying move out. Lots of people do say that. Why live in an area which is conducive to fires? Move the city to another location. Easier said than done. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is if people are going to live in an environment which is made to burn, then at least build the city in a way that provides as little extra fuel as possible. Because right now, the houses themselves are additional fuel. Build the houses to be as fire resistant as possible. There is fire resistant material out there, more expensive, but it exists. Plant vegetation that is as fire resistant as possible. Design the city so when the fire arrives, and it is when, not if, when the fire arrives, it doesn't grow quite so much. If you're about to spend, hypothetically speaking, billions rebuilding a city, rebuild it that way. It could be more expensive, but it will at least help insurance become more affordable, because right now they can't afford insurance because the place is just too much of a risk and the costs when the risk occurs are just too high. Let me explain. The entire insurance system is broken in California. Insured losses for this fire, they could easily top $10 billion, but the biggest problem is that most of the houses aren't insured, or at least they're underinsured. I'll tell you why. The issue started in 1979. There was a California Supreme Court case that allowed third parties to sue insurance companies. And this is California in the 80s, so when they could sue, they did sue. Lots and lots of lawsuits flying around. And it drove insurance premiums right up because, of course, when there's successful lawsuits, they pass those extra costs on in premiums. And so what happens when premiums go right up? There's a push from voters and consumers to get them back down again. That led to Prop 103 in 1988, which pushed an automatic 20% premium cut. That's pretty big. But then it also placed huge restrictions on insurance companies, including their ability to increase premiums. Like, for instance, there was a veto from state government, as well as feedback from public interest groups every single time they want to increase premiums. The state government could veto it. Also, insurance companies can't pass on the costs of reinsurance, which is insurance for insurance companies. They can't pass on those costs to the consumer. They also, when they're calculating their premiums, they have to use past averages of disaster damages when calculating the wildfire risk. Even though, of course, with climate change, that data is changing, the risks are increasing and the costs are increasing. So over time, their premiums have fallen further and further below the real risks and costs of insurance. The result of that is that these days, the premiums for homeowners insurance is about 29% lower than what a fair market price should be, according to at least one report I read. That's an academic report, not a commercial report. That gap, by the way, is the largest in America. Premium payments are also way below cost, generally, for insurance companies. It took 25 years for the entire insurance industry in California to make $10 billion. That's from 1991 to 2016. And then in 2017 and 2018 alone, just from wildfires, the entire insurance industry lost $20 billion. So they lost more in 2 years just from wildfires. They lost twice as much in 2 years just from wildfires than they had taken 25 years to build. Payouts are super slow as well. It's the second slowest in the nation in California at 236 days per claim. So that's rubbish insurance. The result of this, when insurance companies can't afford to actually offer premiums, what are they going to do? In 2023, the 5 major insurers decided to cap the number of new policies that they would write. In fact, the 2 biggest insurers, State Farm and Allstate, said they weren't writing policies for any new customers at all. This year, State Farm actually just cancelled 72,000 policies, bang, including 1,600 in the Palisades. They said if they didn't do that, they would have gone out of business. So Gavin Newsom took unilateral emergency action to give insurance more freedom again to raise their premiums, hopefully save their position in California, but at the same time requiring them to cover more risky properties so they could make more money, but they had to cover people. The hope was that could create a virtuous cycle which would bring them back to California in a healthy state. Basically, they had to cover the same proportion of houses in wildfire areas as non-wildfire areas. That was the deal. And he also undid a lot of the restrictions from Prop 103. Guess when all these amazing changes from Gavin Newsom came into effect? December 30, 2024, a week before the fires began. So they didn't have much time to take effect. But it gets worse because insurance companies have not been insuring people recently. California set up a government-mandated insurer of last resort. It's called the Fair Access to Insurance Requirements Plan, or FAIR. If you can't get insurance from a normal company, you can get it through FAIR. This is cheap insurance, right? It's capped at $3 million per house, which in California is like the back shed, basically. $3 million is not much in California, especially in LA. And when FAIR doesn't have enough money to pay out claims, it takes that money from the other insurance companies. That's how it's legislated. Now, FAIR only covers about 4% of California's insurance market, but of course, most of the riskier houses have FAIR plans, of course, because they're the most expensive to insure. So in this fire, FAIR is expected to suffer $6 billion of losses from the Palisades alone. And that's going to come out of the insurance company's pocket at exactly the same time as they have their own payouts to pay. So it's probably going to drive them out of the state again. So, what have we learned so far? The Californian people have really buggered up their insurance system. It's aided and abetted by climate change, yes, but that's not why the fires started. Their whole controlled burning situation is problematic. They really need to find a way to make it cheaper and easier to do. But they are making progress there. Not enough, but they are making progress. And once again, that's not why the fire was started. It wasn't started by a lack of backburning. They need to build more water storage in the LA area, like they have raised money to do. The Santa Ynez Reservoir would have been handy. It'd be great if they had a more modern water system so the water pressure issues weren't such a problem. But most experts say it wouldn't have stopped the fire anyway. Once it got started, nothing was going to stop it quickly in those conditions. Karen Bass's leadership in particular and her funding commitments to firefighting were questionable at the least. But it was an irritant more than a cause. Once again, sometimes you get natural disasters. They happen all the time. And this was a highly, highly likely time for a fire to break out in LA. So why am I saying all this for about the 10th time? It's because I would not be blaming any government decisions for this fire on this occasion. And yet, a lot of people are. A lot of people are. And unusually, they're threatening to tie disaster aid to that blame. We're seeing a lot of this kind of thing.
California Governor Gavin Newsom wrote recently, he said, quote, "There must be no conditions, no strings attached to disaster aid." And yet we know that there's a big conversation happening right now on Capitol Hill about linking disaster aid for California to an increase in the debt limit, which has been a traditionally really thorny issue. Are you and can you commit that California disaster relief won't have strings attached?
No, I won't commit that because we have a serious problem in California. Listen, there are natural disasters. I'm from Louisiana. We're prone to that. We understand how these things work. But then there's also human error. And when the state and local officials make foolish policy decisions that make the disaster exponentially worse, we need to factor that in. And I think that's a common sense notion.
Now, I moved to attach conditions to aid because Californians brought it on themselves. That's not good. This is another good example from Tommy Tuberville. I can't believe this.
Senator, why should other states be bailing out California for choosing the wrong people to run their state?
We shouldn't be. They got 40 million people in that state, and they voting these imbeciles in office, and they continue to do it. And it's just a very small part of them in that state that's doing it. If you go to California, you run into a lot of Republicans, a lot of good people, and I hate it for them. But they are just overwhelmed by these inner city woke policies with the people that vote for them. And I don't mind sending them some money, but unless they show that they're going to change their ways and get back to building dams and storing water, doing the maintenance with the brush and the trees and everything that everybody else does in the country, and they refuse to do it, they don't deserve anything, to be honest with you, unless they show us they're going to make some changes, Chris.
It's such a shame Dr. Dave missed out on that. He loves Tommy Tuberville clips. But as an aside, Tuberville is the only politician I've seen actually trying to defend Trump's pardon of the violent offenders from January 6 on the merits. Some politicians tried to defend Trump by saying, well, he's trying to, he's trying to reverse an injustice, or they give some excuse, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But there's almost no one saying him pardoning violent people who assaulted police and nearly killed them. And in fact, some police did die directly after the riots as a result of their injuries. That's a great thing. Good pardons. Yeah, that's a great thing. Very few politicians are trying to do that. Tommy Tuberville's one of them. I'll probably play that next week, that clip, just for Dave. Look, I'm not sure the fire was because of wokeness, okay? I'm not sure it has anything to do with woke decisions. And just to be clear, when Tuberville said that the rest of America takes care of fires, why can't California? Would you care to guess the state with the most acres burnt by wildfire in 2022? Did you say Alaska? Because it was Alaska by a mile. 3 million acres. Then on 850,000 acres, there was New Mexico. Then there was Texas. Then there was Oregon. Then there was Idaho. Then there was Oklahoma. Only then there was California on 300,000 acres, even though California is significantly bigger than almost all of those states. Also, very, very few states pay more to Washington than they get back. There's like 10 states that do it. And California, look at that map there. See the orange? They're the guys who are paying more to Washington than they get back. California pays the most to Washington over what it gets back. They paid $83 billion in 2022, more than they got back. So, in conclusion, Tommy Tuberville can fuck off. Jared Moskowitz made a fair point about this, I thought. He said, this is a mistake. If you start this, it will never end. When Dems retake the House, they will condition aid to Florida and Texas. Disaster aid must stay non-partisan. I'd fight Democrats should they try and do this. The Speaker can find many other ways to hold people accountable. 10 out of 10. Jared Moskowitz is often a troll. On this occasion, he's most definitely not. That is correct. The whole thing's begun to get very confused. This whole, they need to have conditions because there's fire, so we should get them to do X. Every single conservative seems to have a different dream list of conditions that they want to blackmail California with for their aid. Hannity, for example, I'll play you here. He's talking about immigration policy concessions for some reason, involving removing sanctuary cities or maybe stopping Gavin Newsom from Trump-proofing California, which is about funding lawsuits against the Trump administration, by the way. I don't know what that has to do with anything. And Mike Johnson, the Speaker, gets extremely confused. Look at this.
L.A. and San Francisco are sanctuary cities.
Yeah.
Okay. Gavin is doubling down on a fight Trump agenda, Trump-proof California.
Right.
And so are you saying that California, if they continue to aid and abet law-breaking and harbor illegal immigrants, money from D.C. gets cut off?
Yeah, we're talking about conditions to this disaster aid. Look, there are natural disasters, but there are man-made disasters as well, and they made terrible decisions. They knew exactly what they were doing. That reservoir outside Pacific Palisades, 117 million gallons, it was empty for a year. Why? They were trying to save a smelt fish or something. I mean, their policies are upside down. They made decisions that made that disaster exponentially worse, and this is what the American taxpayer is demanding of us everywhere else in the country.
How the hell did the Delta smelt, that little fish in North California, get mixed up with a reservoir which had a torn cover? I don't understand how Mike Johnson's put them together. Look, this is clearly now a rhetorical tool rather than an aid package. It's kind of like the box that Schrodinger's cat is in that box where you don't know whether the cat's alive or dead. Is the cat even in the box? No one knows. We just know there's a box and something may be in it. Maybe wokeness. We can all take a guess what that something is. Every Republican is taking their own guess at the moment. What aid, what conditions they want to shove in that box in return for some aid. But this does take us to what's about to happen, because this is all going to come to a head. At some point in time, the fun times on TV news shows has to end and the actual pain of disaster aid funds has to begin. So what happens then? This is my prediction. My prediction is you look at Trump, what he's saying, that's usually what's going to happen. The conditions are obviously going to be blackmail for part of the Trump agenda. Now, I assumed that this was going to be tied to a debt ceiling hike, because there needs to be a debt ceiling hike next month, and the Republicans are very embarrassed about that. But Trump was pretty clear that he had bigger ideas for the blackmail in this case. This is him talking to Dan Bongino.
If you add Los Angeles into it, then you can really do one big, beautiful bill, because, frankly, they want that so badly. They want the money to go out there so badly. And I don't think we should do a bill until Los Angeles is included. And when Los Angeles is included, we get everything we want.
Trump clearly wants to hold LA hostage for his entire agenda. Now, he's not going to be able to do that. I predict he ends up tying it to funding some of his immigration initiatives, because he's desperately going to need more funding for that in weeks. We're going to be talking about that soon. There's going to be a lot of funding necessary for detention, for deportations, for raids. He's going to need a lot of money. And I predict he ties some of that money to this aid. It's going to be interesting. But anyway, before we move on, I should say, we recorded PEP on Thursday night. Dr. Dave wanted me to pass on an article that he saw today that added a bit to his points about Panama. Remember he talked about Panama Canal? He read an article just after he talked about that, which he really liked, and he regretted not having read it before he spoke. So, look, I'll put the article in the blurb for both PEP and PEEP. Just if you look in the blurb underneath the video or in the little podcast box there, look for the homework. The link will be there. All right. That took a long time, but I want to try and cram in some more things as well. We got an hour and a half maybe to talk. I think we got a bit longer. So I want to talk about the Supreme Court quickly. Just a few court case things. I teased I want to talk about porn. I'll talk about the porn case that was just heard by the Supreme Court right now. It's called Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton. Now, it's an interesting conundrum, this one, I think. Texas has just passed an age restriction law for websites, for porn websites, of course, that it's only for websites, quote, that publish a significant amount of sexual material harmful to minors. So, yes, so porn sites. Users have to verify their age to use those sites. Now, this is well-trodden ground in American law. In 2004, there was another case involving age verification law for porn sites called Ashcroft versus ACLU. It was a classic free speech case. Porn is a form of expression in American law. So in Ashcroft versus ACLU, they said, this is free speech, this is speech, the government shouldn't be restricting it in any way. Any restriction of speech by the government faces what they call strict scrutiny in order to be legal. That's the highest barrier that you can clear. To pass strict scrutiny, you need to prove there's a compelling interest in restricting that speech and that the restriction needs to be as narrowly tailored as possible. Age restrictions don't cut it. At least they didn't back in 2004, because even though there was a compelling interest being served by age restrictions protecting children, there were other narrower options available. It has to be the narrowest option. For instance, blocking and filtering software for children only affects the children. So that's a narrower option than everyone having to fill out having to pass some age restriction test. So it was a classic free speech scenario. 2004, the Ashcroft case, I thought this case would just be exactly the same. But then the justices started saying things that gave me food for thought, I have to admit. Even from Sam Alito, who, as you know, I'm not a fan of, he made the point that there is a huge volume of evidence that filtering doesn't work. He's right. It absolutely doesn't work. Kids can get around filters easily. My daughters were using VPNs before they were 10 years old. It's not hard to get around the filter. I am trying to look after them, by the way. I'm not the world's worst father. But I'm just saying that they worked it out for themselves, and that made my job even harder. Amy Coney Barrett noted just how much has changed since 2004 when Ashcroft was decided.
It's been 20 years since Ashcroft. The iPhone was introduced in 2007 and Ashcroft was decided in 2004. I mean, kids can get online porn through gaming systems, tablets, phones, computers. Let me just say that content filtering for all those different devices, I can say from personal experience, is difficult to keep up with. So, and I think that the explosion of addiction to online porn has shown that content filtering isn't working.
And as Brett Kavanaugh noted, if a narrower solution doesn't work, it's not actually a narrower solution, is it? It's not a solution at all. I gotta say, I reckon that's a pretty good point from Brett Kavanaugh. I was surprised to be receptive to these arguments because, I'm a bit of a free speech guy. And I'm not gonna say I'm a bit of a porn guy because other people who I know watch this podcast, but I'm a free speech guy. Let's leave it at that. And then Amy Coney Barrett asked another interesting question. Is age verification even really a barrier? She cites an old case, Ginsburg versus New York, which ruled that stores could be forced to ask for age verification when kids bought girly magazines. I mean, real stores, not online stores, like used to exist once, like newsagents. A newsagent can ask for ID when someone's trying to buy a girly magazine comfortably. And in Ginsburg versus New York, that's what they held. And she said, well, if in the real world age verification isn't considered a barrier, why is it considered a barrier online?
Explain to me why the barrier is different online than in a brick and mortar setting. I mean, in a brick and mortar setting, it seems like a lot of your concerns are driven by privacy concerns, which are really a feature of the internet. I mean, you don't have privacy if you go into the bookstore in Ginsburg or if you go to a movie theater that displays pornographic movies. You have to show age verification. So explain to me why this is so uniquely burdensome here when it's not been in the real world context.
Let me start with that, Justice Barrett, with your question about why is this medium different. And the answer is you're creating a permanent record on the internet when you provide this information, that it is being collected, it is a target for hackers, it is something that is different from just flashing an ID in physical space.
Now, I think the porn industry's lawyer made a pretty good fist there of trying to establish a difference between online and the real world, but I don't think it was hugely convincing. I think Amy Coney Barrett's point was a fair point. So look, I think they might have convinced me a little bit that there could be a case here. The question is, what's your solution? Do you make the age verification law pass the strict scrutiny standard? Do you suggest it does pass that standard? Maybe you say it does pass strict scrutiny now because age verification is the narrowest solution that actually works. Maybe. Or maybe you apply a lower standard to it than strict scrutiny. Maybe Alito was talking about this. He was talking about subjecting the situation to a rational basis test instead. That is, the restriction must have a legitimate state interest and there must be a rational connection between the statute's means and its goals. A rational connection? Almost anything can pass that test. That's no barrier at all for a speech restriction. So that's a pretty low bar to try and beat freedom of speech, I reckon. Amy Coney Barrett was pushing a middle standard. She called it intermediate scrutiny. Well, she didn't call it that. It's already called that. And that's for laws that target... Well, let me give you an example I'm talking about here. Sorry. Intermediate scrutiny asks whether a law serves important government objectives and whether it's substantially related to achievement of those objectives, which is preventing kids having access to sexual speech online. So it's not an easy to pass test, but it's not impossible either. Age verification for a porn site, I think, absolutely would clear that test. Anyway, look, I don't know what they're going to come up with. Kavanaugh had a theory as well, which I didn't quite follow, but there are a few theories thrown around of ways they can try and make the age verification for porn sites legal, at least in Texas where the law is passed, without just destroying all protections for free speech. So I'll be interested to see which one they choose. And I must say, I found myself surprisingly convinced by them. So we'll see how they justify it. I want to talk about net neutrality quickly too. First of all, a Loper-Bright recap. I spoke to you last year at the Loper-Bright decision from the Supreme Court. This was the decision, well, actually 4 decisions. They all came the same week, all of which had the same basic effect, which was to make it harder for agencies to write regulations without Congress's input. Basically, the Supreme Court created a bunch of barriers for agencies to clear. And the highest barrier was set there by the Loper-Bright case. And what the Loper-Bright case said was that courts would no longer defer to the agency's interpretation of what a law meant. So from now on, courts would interpret the regulations themselves, even if it was specialized, even if the regulation was highly technical, and the agencies would just have to lump it. Now, everyone could see that this was a potential bomb set to go off in American governance. Well, this year, we already saw the first casualty of that bomb on the second day of the year, and it's net neutrality. Now, for those who weren't into political news comedy shows about 10 to 15 years ago, This was a huge hobby horse of John Oliver at one point. Net neutrality is the idea that no internet service provider is allowed to favour one website over another. The fear was that some big companies would pay for priority access so their websites and services would load faster and other sites would load slower. And that would theoretically make the internet terrible. The left in America were very determined to save net neutrality, and the right didn't give two hoots about net neutrality. And this battle was fought repeatedly in the FCC, which is the Federal Communications Commission. That's the agency in charge of regulating communications in America. And the climax, communication services, not talking, like phone companies, the TV stations. And the climax of this fight was when Trump's FCC finally got rid of net neutrality. And then Biden's FCC took over and brought it back. Well, after the Loper Bright case, someone took Biden's FCC to court. And during the holidays, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals dropped the bomb. They ruled that the FCC isn't even in charge of internet service providers, and so the FCC has no power to impose net neutrality. It's outside of their jurisdiction. What the court said was, quote, unlike past challenges that the DC Circuit considered under Chevron, that's the old case before Loper Bright, we no longer afford deference to the FCC's reading of the statute. Instead, our task is to determine the best reading of the statute in the first instance. Using the traditional tools of statutory construction, we hold that broadband internet service providers offer only an information service, and therefore the FCC lacks the statutory authority to impose its desired net neutrality policies through the telecommunications service provision of the Communications Act. So, FCC can no longer regulate net neutrality. That's what they said. Just to spell that out. The FCC, according to the statute, can regulate telecommunication services. The law defines telecommunication services as services that offer telecommunications for a fee directly to the public or to such classes of users as to be effectively available directly to the public, regardless of the facilities used. That's what telecommunication service is. That's what the FCC regulates. The court said ISPs are not that. Instead, they said ISPs are information services, which are defined as services offering a capability for generating, acquiring, storing, transforming, processing, retrieving, utilizing, or making available information via telecommunications, and includes electronic publishing, but does not include any use of such capability for the management, control, or operation of a telecommunications system or the management of a telecommunications service. So they're saying ISPs make information available, not telecommunications. I would disagree with that. I would say that some people use the internet for telecommunications. Like some people use WhatsApp as their phone service. Some people use internet phones. Some people use Skype. It's not huge numbers of people, but some people do. So I'm not sure it's 100% right. But that's what the court said, and it's up to the court to determine it under Loper Bright. It's their judgment. The FCC... So the court said that's what an ISP is, a information service. Therefore, the ISPs can't be regulated by the FCC. Now, in the past, the FCC decided otherwise. Now, after Loper Bright, the courts decide they don't care what the FCC thinks. Look, while I think they're factually wrong about the internet, I thought their legal logic was all sound. I just disagree with their judgment because I disagree with their assessment of the internet. But I don't think this is a wildly ridiculous decision. I think the legal logic is kind of sound, to be honest. As I said, I just disagree with their judgment about the internet. Anyway, they ruled it. So the conclusion is net neutrality is dead. Probably for good. Oh, look, Congress could bring back net neutrality, but Congress it's hard to pass anything through Congress. So it's effectively dead. And no one seemed to notice. That's partly because this legal theory is so technical and arcane, I imagine. But it's also partly because the decision dropped on January 2. I think that's probably the main reason. Either way, that's why you listen to PEP, because I tell you about this stuff. So I hope you enjoyed that. Sorry, PEEP. I also want to tell you about the Judges Act. Lots of court stuff here. Or another name for this section is why we can't have nice things. Back in 2023, a neutral body, the Judicial Conference of the United States, requested that Congress create more federal judgeships. Now, their logic was pretty sound. Federal district courts had 348,000 new civil cases filed just in 2024. That's an increase of 22% from 2023. Meanwhile, as of the end of March 2023, there were 690,000 cases in the queue for federal district courts. So 350,000 new civil cases in a year with 690,000 cases in the queue already. On average, it takes 8.7 months for a civil case to finally be disposed of. That's too slow. It needs to be faster. They can't wait 9 months for your average case. Meanwhile, the last time Congress passed a proper bill to add judgeships in America was back in 1990. So, the Judicial Conference asked Congress to create 2 appeals court judgeships and 66 district court judgeships, amongst other things. And Congress last year responded. Just for once, Congress tried to fix the situation. They responded with the Judges Act. It would create 66 new district court judgeships over 3 presidencies. From 2025 through to 2035, it would add judgeships every 2 years. That's clever. It's fair. It's well thought through. That way, the next president doesn't just get 66 judgeships. It's a huge advantage for his party. They spread it out over 3 presidencies. That's reasonable. Furthermore, they designed to pass this bill before the election so no one would know who was going to get first dibs at nominating more judges. Okay, so that's nice and fair. What happened? Well, the Senate passed the bill unanimously in August last year. Great. Unfortunately, the House then started dicking around with the bill. Clearly, the House Republicans were keen to see who would win the election before they passed the bill, so they would know which party's president would be the first to nominate extra judges. Presumably, if the Democrats won, they wouldn't have been so keen on passing the bill then. Anyway, the House ended up passing the bill in the middle of December, like 4 months after the Senate. Coincidentally, it was after Trump won. And now it was, you guessed it, the Democrats dragging their feet. The bill ended up passing 236 to 173. 173 Democrats voted against it. And of course, Joe Biden vetoed it. Now, he said he only vetoed it because he found the process of deciding how judges should be allocated was all very hurried, he thought. It was too hurried. Sure, Joe. Sure. Very hurried. Yeah. Whatever you reckon. Anyway, no new judges. I know I just said why we can't have nice things. I'm not saying a new judge is necessarily a nice thing, but yeah, in this case, it's a relatively nice thing, all right? The point is Congress is going to have to try again this year. We'll see what happens. Okay, now there's a white flash just now because I wanted to check the time because it feels like I've been talking forever. But no, I've been talking about 50 minutes. So I reckon I can squeeze in one more section. I reckon the interview is going to go for about an hour and a half. So I reckon an hour and a half of content, an hour and a half of interview, gives you 3 hours. Combined, that's 6.5 hours of PEP plus PEEP. You can't complain, but you guys know we've been away for a while and a lot's happened. And all this stuff I'm telling you, there are reasons for it. So I don't feel guilty. No regrets. Okay. I'm going to talk immigration now because next week we're going to talk so much more about immigration. Obviously, this is the key issue in the first part of the Trump administration. I want to give a little context to where we're at before we go deep into the immigration executive orders next week. We all know Biden struggled a bit with the numbers of arrests on the southern border. Okay, we know that. But there is something that's not well known. At least one of the key reasons for Biden's struggles. The New York Times wrote an article about this a few weeks ago. It turns out that what goes on in Mexico is extremely important when it comes to immigration. If Mexico is trying to help America repeal migrants from the border, it goes a long way to reducing migration numbers. And of course, if they're doing nothing, it creates a problem for America. Now, we all knew that. But what came out recently was that Mexico's immigration chief over the last few years was a little bit corrupt. Francisco Garduno Yanez. He ran the immigration agency, and basically that agency took bribes to wave migrants through Mexico to America. According to the New York Times, migrants said they had to pay Mexican migration agents to travel through the country to reach the United States, i.e. bribes. There was also a 2022 British Embassy classified report that the New York Times somehow got their hands on, which also apparently found systemic corruption in the government's handling of migrants, including extortion, sexual abuse, and collusion with criminal organizations to kidnap migrants for ransom. Nasty. Furthermore, Garduno apparently lied about the migrant numbers through Mexico for official reports. For a couple of years there, he was basically cutting in half what he said the number of migrants who got through to America were. And the American numbers were way more, and they just didn't match. And after a while, people got very suspicious, and they started to investigate what was going on with him. In October 2023, some of that dodginess was well and truly exposed within the government, and he put in a bit more of an effort to cover his tracks. So he started interfering with the migrant flow a bit more. His agents stepped up security on the trains, which is the way many migrants used to travel north through Mexico to America. And the number of migrants encountered at the border dropped by nearly 13% in the next 2 months, as soon as the crackdown began. Then there was a budget crunch in Mexico. So Garduno sent a memo ordering his agency to save money by pausing deportation flights that carried undocumented migrants, to withdraw personnel from checkpoints, to shut down the busing program that bussed migrants from the Mexican-American border back down south again. So that was relieving pressure on the northern border. The memo that went out, we're going to save lots of money with all these measures, it was leaked. And presumably the migrants saw that leak because they're not idiots. So then they rushed to the US border. This was in December. It was December 2023. And you might recall December 2023 having the highest number of migrant encounters on the border in history. It was nearly 250,000 migrants that month. That's why it was so high. It wasn't because Biden became particularly old in December 2023. It's because Mexico dropped the ball, and it was leaked that they were dropping the ball, and the migrants took advantage of that. Now, Mexico was extremely embarrassed by that. The Biden administration was extremely furious about that, and everyone in the Mexican government was placed under serious pressure, including Garduno. They pushed him a lot harder. And so Mexico deployed National Guard troops to immigration checkpoints. They bussed migrants even further south than they did before. Many more busing services. They broke up migrant caravans. They went crazy. And what happened? Well, let's have a look at some graphs to tell you. Well, spoiler, the numbers drop right off. Okay, so yes, it worked. As soon as Mexico pulled their finger out, the numbers dropped right down. Now let's look at the graphs. It's a little known fact that in the last month of Biden, there were fewer arrests on the border than in the last month of Trump. quite a bit fewer, actually. Look at that graph right there. The last month of Obama saw 43,000 border arrests. The last month of Trump saw 71,000 border arrests. This is during COVID too, by the way. The last month of Biden saw 47,000 border arrests. Significantly less than Trump. Now, to be fair to Trump, this is not as impressive as it looks because remember, Biden has a parole program and also an app where migrants came over in an orderly fashion. So they weren't being arrested on the border, but they're still entering the country. There's about 50,000 extra migrants coming through in an orderly fashion. So it was more like if you're counting just the people coming through, not trying to sneak through and being arrested on the border, but people coming through through a legitimate path, like an organized path. If you count all of them, then there's more like 97,000 border crossings to Trump's 71,000 border crossings. Either way, that's still really close to Trump. And Trump was during COVID, so he had a huge advantage. There was a lockdown then. So Trump's effort, in hindsight, was actually kind of pathetic, especially since he's got this reputation as being Mr. Shut Down the Border. Yeah, he tried to do severe things, but they didn't necessarily work as well as people think. But look, what about gotaways? They're the ones that really count. They're the people who sneak in completely and evade detection. They're the scariest migrants because they're the ones that could be terrorists. They're the ones who could be criminals. They could be anything. They're people who are going out of their way to not be detected. So let's look at that graph, a new graph. Let's look at the gotaways graph. Obama ended his term with 9,000 gotaways in the final month. Trump left his final term with 22,000 gotaways. Once again, in COVID. And Biden is going to leave fewer than 13,000 gotaways. Now, there's no getting around that. Biden is doing better than Trump did with the most dangerous and concerning illegal immigrants. That is noteworthy. Biden's done better than people think. And while I'm at it, the arrest average inside America. Okay, so this is the people who have been arrested, the illegal immigrants who have been arrested in America to presumably be detained and deported, arrested by ICE. Under Trump and under Biden, they were almost exactly the same numbers. So Trump, trying his hardest to arrest and detain and deport, ended up doing about the same numbers of arrests inside America as Biden did. So Trump didn't exactly blow people away when it came to dealing with illegal immigration, after all, despite his reputation. But there was a big difference between Biden and Trump, and this is important context to understand before next week. It's not illegal immigration. Look at this graph. This is a graph of legal immigrants. Legal immigrants went from 289,000 new legal migrants in the first quarter after Obama to 132,000 new legal migrants in the first quarter after Trump. That's the reason I'm saying first quarter after is because that is the result of their actions in the quarter before. To 395,000 new legal migrants in the last quarter of Biden. So there'll be another number in one more quarter. But that gives you an idea. Basically, many more legal migrants under Obama and Biden than there was under Trump. That's the difference with Trump. Far fewer legal migrants. So expect to see that again during this term. I predict illegal migrants at the end of his term are not going to be as low as people think, but legal migrants are going to be rock bottom. One more thing about the context in which this is all happening. There are going to be a lot of crazy things being promised over the next few months. There have already been a lot of crazy things promised in the first 3 days. But someone has already imposed a Trump-like system. And that is Ron DeSantis in Florida. The Wall Street Journal wrote an article about that the other day. Let me read you the first paragraph of that article. It's called, "What Happened After Florida Cracked Down on Illegal Immigration." Florida's 2023 law cracking down on illegal immigration has prompted some workers to leave the state and made filling jobs harder for some small businesses. Still, the law hasn't resulted in huge disruptions to the state's labour market, as some predicted. Certain provisions were watered down before the bill passed or in its implementation, and the state has done little to enforce the law. So, I think that's a good clue of what to expect. Trump's going to do some different stuff from DeSantis, obviously. But broadly speaking, I think it gives you a good idea of the mindset behind the changes. There's big talk, there's a lot of promises, and there's very little enforcement where it might hurt the government. So that way, we don't see the kind of huge disruptions that you might fear. That's another prediction of mine with Trump. He can say he's doing whatever he wants, but do you think he's really going to have raids of, say, farms and factories in red states that rely on illegal immigration to get by? I predict there will not be many of them. And if there are, I predict that before long, those illegal immigrants will be replaced by other undocumented immigrants. They are not going to want a huge disruption. And I predict that that is what we're going to see. But I might be wrong. Okay, now a big area in immigration that's going to be contested, I think, throughout the Trump administration. It's already been contested, is H1B visas. H1B visas are meant to be for high-skilled workers. The way they work, this is important context for the next few weeks, I suspect. Prospective employers sponsor workers who want a visa. They're supposed to be high-skilled workers, right? So they're not easily obtained in America. People have to go outside America to get. Those workers who are qualified, the bar is not high to be qualified for the H1B visa program, but you need to have some skills. Go into a lottery, and the lucky employers get their workers. It is a controversial program, though, because pro-worker types like Bernie Sanders, they say dodgy businesses exploit the program to undercut local worker wages. Then tech types, though, say the program is absolutely critical, and they need more H1B workers, actually. There have been a lot of these kinds of arguments going on lately between Elon Musk and Steve Bannon. And if you haven't heard about their arguments, you should really look into them because they are spicy. Those guys hate each other. Bannon, for some reason, I don't know why, spoke to an Italian newspaper to bitch about Elon Musk. Whatever. Here's some of the stuff he said. I'll have Elon Musk run out of here by Inauguration Day. Sorry, Steve. He is a truly evil guy, a very bad guy. I made it my personal thing to take this guy down. And then, this thing of the H1B visas, it's about the entire immigration system is gamed by the tech overlords. They use it to their advantage. The people are furious. He should go back to South Africa. Why do we have South Africans? The most racist people on earth, white South Africans. We have them making any comments at all on what goes on in the United States. Who would have thought Steve Bannon would be racist like that? Anyway, he'll do anything to make sure that any one of his companies is protected or has a better deal or he makes more money. His aggregation of wealth and then through wealth, power, that's what he's focused on. Okay, so that was an interview to an Italian newspaper. And then Musk responded, the reason I'm in America, along with so many critical people who built SpaceX, Tesla, and hundreds of other companies that made America strong, is because of H1B. Take a big step back and fuck yourself in the face. I'll go to war on this issue, the likes of which you cannot possibly comprehend. And that's something Elon is very good at, by the way, getting into entertaining arguments and then working in some meme reference. But back to H1Bs. It basically splits the MAGA base in two, between those business types and the nationalist types. And Trump stands right in the middle of the Venn diagram between the two groups, which is why it's such a live issue at the moment. So, what's the truth about H1Bs? Who's right? The program is certainly popular. There are 85,000 H1B visas handed out per year, and there were 446,000 applicants in 2023. But is Bernie Sanders and Steve Bannon right? Well, kind of, actually. The problem is that dodgy companies do take advantage of the fact that the program has a lottery. You see, if you have a high-tech business who's got just one special worker that they're interested in, you can apply for that worker. Sure, do it. But say there's an outsourcing company. They could sponsor hundreds of people who have basic IT skills to be their dog's bodies, essentially. And then that outsourcing company has literally hundreds of times the chance of that high-tech company from before of getting the employee they want. In fact, they'll end up getting many employees that they want. They don't care which employees they get. If they go for 1,000 employees and they end up getting, say, 200, that's still a big win for them. Their sponsorees are all interchangeable because they're not really all that high skilled. So this is really a perversion of the spirit of the system, but it happens all the time. It means also that their employees probably aren't going to be very highly paid, and that would undercut local workers. So Sanders and Bannon are right about that. Now, they try to stop this happening with the system by they make employers pay guest workers at least as much as they pay their American workers for the same jobs. But they're basically a glorified temp agency, so they're not paying their local workers very much in the first place. That wage, it's still a princely sum for an Indian, which obviously 3/4 of these H1B workers are. But those companies can make the salary matching pledges fine while still exploiting the foreign workers. So this is why Bloomberg found about 40% of all H1B visas went to IT staffing and outsourcing companies. And to be clear, those employees are still decently paid. That same investigation from Bloomberg found a median wage of $90,000 amongst those outsourcing company workers. So they're getting paid okay, but those companies are still using the H1B program to drive wages down. The system can also be used to exploit the foreign workers themselves, even though they're happy, these workers. You see, the outsourcing companies, they don't really value these workers. They've got hundreds of them. So if the worker loses the job, they don't really care. They can just find another worker. But from the worker's perspective, if they lose their job, they have to find a new employer who will sponsor them within 60 days or they get deported. So there's a massive power imbalance there between the outsourcing company and the workers. All right, so why have the program at all? Bernie Sanders and Steve Bannon are right, aren't they? Well, not completely. You see, while the H1B program might undercut some local workers, research suggests that the program boosts wages and employment of American workers overall. There are also some companies who use this program the right way. Those workers are super valuable for the economy. They lead to a huge increase in innovation and productivity and wages for everyone. Not to mention, that program is great for the foreign workers themselves, even if they were being exploited. So what's the answer? It's really simple. Get rid of the lottery. Just judge on a case-by-case basis the worthiest cases so you can get rid of all the dud applications. And that's pretty much what happens in Australia. In Australia, they judge each individual on their merits. They have a point system. There's no lotteries. The people who get lots of points, they come through. So you could just do that. And that gives you all the benefits of high-skilled immigration without so many of the problems. And if the workers are given visas on the basis of being particularly special, then you should give them a little more leeway if they get fired, because America probably really wants to hold on to a worker like that. So that's my take on the H1B visa. We'll see what Trump comes up with, because he really is torn between the two sides on this issue. Okay, there are 2 immigration-related bills which are left. Let me look at the time here. You know what? I'll go for it. I can't help myself. Laken Riley, the Laken Riley Act. Now, Laken Riley was a Georgia woman who was murdered by an illegal immigrant, Jose Ibarra, last year. Sadly, Ibarra had been arrested in New York for riding a scooter without a helmet, and was also arrested in Georgia for shoplifting. But both times, Ibarra was let go because these were such minor offences. And then he went on to murder Laken Riley. So the idea of the Laken Riley Act is to stop that happening. The first part of the Laken Riley Act says that if an undocumented migrant commits a reasonably serious crime, then the Act will force ICE to detain them if the police won't. And ICE will be forced to keep them there until they are deported. Now, the bill doesn't force the police to do anything, but ICE will have no choice. If the police aren't detaining them, then ICE have to. Once an alien who is inadmissible is arrested for committing a listed crime in the Act, ICE is obligated to not let them go free. And to be honest, I think the crimes, if they're reasonably serious, I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with this concept. I think a lot of people would be fine with it. I mentioned on Planet America, according to a Fox poll, this month, 59% of people said they would favour not just detaining, but deporting illegal immigrants who have been charged with crimes. But the devil is very much in the details. Let me go through the problems of the first part. There's a lot of them. Many more than I mentioned on Planet America. Affected crimes can be quite minor. Shoplifting, for instance. Not a big deal. That's covered under the Act. And the crime doesn't even have to be committed in America. If ICE believe that someone shoplifted in Mexico before they came to America, then ICE is obligated to detain and deport them as well when they find out. The Act also applies to children. A 12-year-old kid who gets arrested for shoplifting is out of here. Oliver Twist, get yourself deported, mate. There is no room for you in America under the Laken Riley Act. Well, assuming he's an illegal immigrant from England, I guess, from Dickensian England. It's not just affecting migrants hiding in the shadows either. The bill includes migrants who cross the border on their own but have since been granted asylum. So they qualified for asylum, but if they were caught shoplifting, they then get detained and deported. The worst bit, though, by a mile, is this. Only an arrest is required, not a charge. Definitely not a conviction is required. So if the police make a mistake, you still get detained and deported under this law. Even if the police drop the charges, it doesn't matter. You're going to get detained and deported if you get arrested under this bill. And by the way, being detained might get in the way of you showing up to court for your trial. Or it might get in the way of you preparing a proper defense, stopping you from clearing your name. Even worse, you could be deported before you even have your trial to clear your name. That's particularly dystopian. You get arrested, you're an innocent person, you get deported before you get a chance to prove you're innocent. And even if you did prove you're innocent, you're getting deported anyway. And this, by the way, this whole arrest thing makes the Laken Riley Act a perfect vehicle for blackmail. I'll quote Aaron Reichlin-Melnick. He's a senior fellow at the American Immigration Council. He said, this could be used by unscrupulous employers or abusive husbands and spouses to threaten people, threatening to report them for a theft, and in the hopes that they would then be arrested, and then ICE would be required to prioritize taking that person into custody, and then that person will be ineligible for release on immigration bond. Absolutely spot on. Of course, detaining and deporting everyone who commits a minor crime is going to cost a lot of money, because that's going to be a lot of detaining and deporting. ICE estimate it'll cost $83 billion over the next 3 years for 118,000 additional detention beds, 40,000 more personnel, and a 25% increase in deportation flights, which would be required. The only problem is the Act contains no extra funding at all. So that's a massive fail, and it's not going to work. Also, there's opportunity cost, because unless you can't detain and unless you can detain and deport absolutely everybody, I promise you that will not happen, especially with no funding. Every person you detain and deport is taking the place of someone else. Someone who might be a higher value deportee. When you're detaining and deporting Oliver Twist, you're not detaining and deporting someone who might have committed a real crime. That's why the Obama administration, which deported a hell of a lot more people than Trump did, by the way, focused on deporting the least desirable people first. But the Laken Riley Act throws all of that out the window. That's the first part. Then there's a second part, which allows state attorneys general to sue the federal government when they think the government isn't being tough enough on immigration law enforcement. That's right. The state has standing to sue the federal government for individual detention decisions, for liberal policies or programs. If they don't like a parole program, they can sue the federal government about it. They can also sue to force visa bans on specific countries that aren't accepting deportees. Say Venezuela doesn't accept any deportees. The state attorney general can sue the federal government to force a visa ban on Venezuela. All you need to be able to do to qualify for one of these lawsuits to sue the federal government is show $100 of damage to the state. Not a high bar. Remember, immigration enforcement's meant to be the discretion of the federal government. But this bill flips that on its head. As long as the federal government isn't tough enough for your liking, of course, in the cases where the states think that the federal government's been too tough and they want to sue it if they want to sue it to make it more liberal, you can't do that. Sorry, you can't do that. Only to make them more tough. Just think what a state like Texas that loves right-wing lawfare, think about what they would do with this power. They could swamp the courts with this crap. By the way, Steve Bannon has openly said he's going to try to use this provision to hound India so they can get a visa ban against India to shut down the H1B visa program, which he hates so much. So even MAGA people are looking to exploit this bill. You might be wondering, by the way, what this second part has to do with Laken Riley's death, because it's in the Laken Riley Act. The answer is absolutely nothing. But the Democrats are so pathetically cowed by the election results at the moment. They're bending over backwards to show that they're tough on immigration. So they're waving this piece of shit through. In the House, 48 of the 215 Democrats voted for it. In the Senate, 12 Democrats voted for it, so it can't be filibustered. Ruben Galejo and John Fetterman co-sponsored this bill. The only amendments to this bill in the Senate were to add more crimes to the list. So the bill's going to happen. It's passed in the Senate. It's going to go back to the House again and be passed again. And then Trump will obviously sign it. I suspect in the end, ICE's upcoming funding shortages are going to compromise this bill's impact, but I predict it's going to be a massive pain in the ass for ICE. This is a terrible bill. And remember, I'm big on immigration enforcement. I'm really, really pro-immigrant, and I really strongly think legal immigration should be very high in America. But I want to stop illegal immigration. I want it to be orderly and reasonable and not chaotic. So I support things that are going to discourage illegal immigration, but this is just ridiculous. This is terribly written, but it's going to happen. One more terribly written bill is the Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act. This is Nancy Mace's stupid bill. She never runs out of ways to promote herself by being awful, does Nancy? And this one's classic Mace. She says this bill is going to amend the Immigration and Nationality Act to provide that aliens who have been convicted or who have committed sex offences or domestic violence are inadmissible and deportable. At least, unlike the Laken Riley Act, you have to be convicted or have to have actually committed the act. That's one change, thankfully. But this bill also will apply to stalking, child abuse, child neglect, child abandonment, or violating the portion of a protection order against credible threats of violence, repeated harassment, or bodily injury. Now, there are two obvious questions here. One, why does this bill need to exist? Anyone who has committed any of those crimes is already inadmissible and deportable. And two, why did the National Task Force to End Sexual Assault campaign against this bill? I'm going to play a long slab from Jamie Raskin in the House because he nails it.
When it comes to crimes involving moral turpitude, there are exceptions in the law to protect domestic violence victims who often get swept up in the very laws designed to protect them. Anyone who's ever been a prosecutor or a public defender in this chamber knows that it's common for abusers to accuse their victims of domestic violence themselves and assault, sometimes truthfully, often falsely, but in any event, it's well known that the victims get arrested, prosecuted, and sometimes even convicted simply for defending themselves and fighting back against their abusers and rapists. Here's a real-life example drawn from the domestic violence survivor advocacy groups opposing their legislation. A young woman on a student visa here was trapped in an abusive relationship, and her estranged boyfriend tried to rape her. She fought back, biting his ear and drawing blood. She then called the police to report the rape. But upon seeing the boyfriend's injury, the officers also arrested the female victim, whose language skills kept her from comprehensively explaining what had happened at that point. She spent several days in jail and was ultimately convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence. But the judge sentenced her to time served once she got a lawyer and translation services, which allowed the context of her violent abuse that she'd been enduring to become made plain to the police and the court. Now, because of exceptions that exist in our laws today, this woman was not deemed inadmissible to America because her simple assault charge carried less than a 6-month penalty. But under the new bill, which would establish inadmissibility without any waivers or exceptions at all for victims, she would clearly have to be deemed inadmissible to America. No exceptions would exist any longer for domestic violence victims who have committed minor crimes in the context of resisting their violent abuse. This means that the victim in this case, who's legally in the United States on a student visa while she attends college, would be barred permanently from obtaining a green card or any new immigration status simply because she was a victim of an attempted rape who fought back against her attacker. With no ability ever to adjust her status under the law, she would be deported and kicked out of our country permanently.
So in summary, if anyone who commits domestic violence can be deported, then if you defend yourself against your abuser, they can accuse you of domestic violence and you might be deported. That is a recipe for migrant women who are suffering abuse to just shut up and take it because they're scared of being deported themselves, especially if they have language barriers or they don't really understand the law. They might just not take the risk. So why don't they just amend the bill? If this bill has to exist, I'm not sure it should, but let's say it does have to exist, why not amend it to add a provision that protects self-defense? If they did protect self-defense, maybe the Democrats would vote for it. I'd vote for it if it protected self-defense because that's the only issue. There were a number of proposed amendments by Democrats. That was one of them. None got up. But it ended up passing in the House. 213 Republicans and 61 Democrats. 15 didn't vote and 145 Democrats voted no, which of course Nancy Mace just loved talking about in one of her trademark power walking down the corridor video formats.
I just walked off the House floor where we voted to pass my bill, H.R. 30, Preventing Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act, and the bill passed 274 to 145. So 145 Democrats voted against the bill this time. The bill will head to the Senate next, and I abhor anyone on the left in this country who doesn't want to protect women and girls who are victims of rape, who are victims of pedophilia, the murderers who are here illegally. We absolutely must deport them.
She loves that format. Look, I would normally ignore this bill because it's kind of dumb, but it's going to get up. And you are almost certainly going to hear in the future someone accuse one of the Democrat House members of not being against raping and murdering women. And you're going to want to know why people are saying that. This bill is going to be the reason why, okay? It's a piece of bullshit. Anyway, much more on immigration law next week. Let's now get to our big interview today. That is our first big PEP or PEEP interview, and it's with one of my favourite journos, Radley Balko. Radley used to write for the Washington Post, although he's now on a Substack, which is at radleybalko.substack.com. He tends to write quite long, detailed pieces about criminal justice issues and civil liberties issues, which is why I like him. And those pieces are often about things I haven't heard of at all. They're usually topics that you will not have read about. He goes on his own. He goes on his own path as Radley Balko. And I'm really glad I learned about all of his pieces, the topics. They're great. So, for example, I was reading on his Substack about a case called Illinois versus Winfield. This was a case where forensic science was finally called out. For years, I've read stories about how some of the science behind forensic science is really dubious. I mean, some of it's for legit, but some of it is dubious, and it's used in courts. And people are found guilty on the basis of this dubiously evidenced practice. And the issue finally came to a head in one court case in Illinois. Radley wrote a very interesting piece about it. So I interviewed him for Plain America to talk about this case. Now, it hasn't been to air yet. It'll either be next week or the week after. But I'll now play you the long version of that interview. And then after that, we're going to have a whole lot more of Radley Balko. So I'll speak to you again in 18 minutes. See you then. Radley, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, Radley, I know you're not a scientist, but as someone who's been reporting on this kind of stuff for some time, what is the general state of evidence for criminal forensic science? Are some tests more proven than others?
Well, I think, the main problem with most fields of forensics is that they were developed within police departments, not in scientific labs. So, for decades, we've been relying on methods of analysis that haven't been really subjected to the scientific method and to scientific inquiry. And so for going back to, I think the first fingerprint case was over 100 years ago here in the US, the courts have done a poor job of sorting good expertise from the more kind of charlatan-esque expertise. And so what happened when DNA came along, DNA was developed within the scientific community. It was subjected to the scientific method and scientific testing. And so what DNA showed us, with near certainty, is that a lot of these fields that we've relied on for a long time and thought were, almost foolproof, had been sending innocent people to prison. And so since then, we've been trying to kind of DNA created an opportunity. It was a bit of a wake-up call to go back and say, all right, we should relook at a lot of these fields that have claimed to be steeped in science but really aren't and start testing them. And what we found is that a lot of these fields, there's no scientific underpinning. There's no science. They're not grounded in any real scientific research at all. And so the courts are still trying to figure this out, and they're not doing a particularly good job of it, mostly because judges are trained to do legal analysis, not scientific analysis. And so what happens in a lot of these cases is the courts just simply look to what other courts have done in the past instead of asking, more pertinent and, sometimes profound questions like, did those courts get it right the first time around? And a lot of times the answer is that they didn't.
So in your view, are any of these fields legit? Fingerprints, DNA testing, bite marks, any of it?
So DNA testing is absolutely legitimate. I think there are, it's with the exception of some fields like bite mark analysis, and even then, if there's a clear bite mark on someone and your main suspect doesn't have any teeth, then you could probably safely say that that isn't the person who left the bite, right? But the main problem is analysts overstating their case or overstating their certainty. So, fingerprint, when you have a full fingerprint, there is, and you have a full fingerprint match to someone, there's a good chance that that's the person that left that mark. The problem is we can't say for certain that everyone has a unique fingerprint. That's something we've been saying for a long time, or that's sort of been part of pop culture for a long time, but it's never really been proven. And it gets even worse when you start talking about partial fingerprints. So it's, there are some fields I think that should not be, allowed anywhere near a jury. I think bite mark analysis is one of them. There are others like fingerprints, like some types of hair and carpet fiber analysis where, there are some things you can say. And even with forensic firearms, you can say that this gun is incapable of firing this caliber of bullet. Or you can say, in some cases, you can say there are some makes and models of guns that leave these types of marks. The problem is more about inclusion than exclusion. So in other words, there are lots of areas of forensic where you can say, I can exclude this person as being the source of this hair because the person has brown hair and this hair is red. Where you run into problems is when you say this hair could only have come from this person to the exclusion of all other people on the planet. And that's what we've seen, over and over again, used as evidence to send people to prison and sometimes even to death row. And that's where we run into problems.
Okay, now tell us about Illinois versus Winfield. What was the forensic evidence in play there, and what did Judge Hooks find about it?
So in this case, it was a pretty standard forensic firearms case where you had, a suspect who was accused of firing a bullet. The police were able to, or a forensic analyst was able to match the bullet to the gun and was going to testify that, this bullet can only have come from this gun, which happened to be in the possession of the suspect, Winfield. And so in the Chicago Public Defender's Office, they're one of the better funded public defender's offices in the country. And so they're able to have a forensics department. And they were able to have one attorney in particular who spent a lot of time researching forensic firearms and was able to file a very, evidence-based challenge to the state's forensic analyst. And, there have been a handful of courts in the United States over the years that have put restrictions on what forensic firearms analysts can say. So, for example, there are a few courts that won't allow them to say a bullet is a match to a gun, or they won't say that this gun fired this bullet. I can say that to a near scientific certainty. But for the most part, they have, this kind of analysis is used every day, hundreds of times in courtrooms across the country. And in this case, the judge, who's a judge in Chicago in a circuit court, upheld or ruled in favor of the defense and said basically that this analyst could not testify. And he went into, we can go into the details as as deep as you'd like, but basically he said that there's really no scientific evidence for the proposition that somebody can match one bullet to one gun to the exclusion of all other guns. And then he further ruled that because of that, and because of the only real scientifically sound analysis that a firearms analyst can give to a jury is to say this gun is only capable of firing this caliber of ammunition, that kind of testimony isn't really expertise because it's something a lot of lay people, know just sort of intuitively. And so because of that, there was no reason to let this person testify because they couldn't give any testimony that was scientifically sort of grounded in science that would have been expertise that the layperson didn't know. And so it was really, it was one ruling by one judge in one court in one city. But it was kind of revolutionary in the fact that it was the first time a judge had ever really done this kind of analysis, had really delved into the science and, came up with what I think is a very, scientific ruling, which is that we just can't say this. Like we can't, juries put a lot of faith in expert witnesses, particularly in expert witnesses who testify for the prosecution. And that what they say has to be grounded in science. And for too long, that hasn't been the case. And so this judge, kind of struck a blow, I think, for science. And it sent kind of shockwaves, at least throughout Chicago.
Now, Judge Hooks was replaced after a racial controversy. So what did his replacement, Judge Coleman, have to say about that same case?
Right. So, yeah, so he was kind of forced into retirement, and this judge that replaced him, Judge Coleman. So when she takes his place, the state files a motion for reconsideration, which is sort of standard, but almost never, ever granted. And the reason why is because you're basically saying to a judge, are you sure that this is right? And most judges aren't particularly, they think they gave a lot of thought to the original opinion. But in this case, it was a new judge. And so she had a chance to reconsider, this controversial ruling by her predecessor. And she ends up ruling for the state. And, I think what's interesting, there are a couple of things about the two opinions contrast that I think are interesting. One is, as I said, Judge Coleman's opinion is very standard in a case like this. She looks at what previous courts have done. And so she says, over and over and over again, appellate courts across the country have upheld the legitimacy of this type of forensic analysis. And, that is what you would expect a judge to do. That is how you perform a legal analysis. Judge Hooks did a scientific analysis. And, if you kind of take Judge Coleman's opinion to its logical conclusion, it would be that, once enough courts rule that a particular area of forensics is legitimate, no amount of science is ever going to be able to undo that, right? Because the courts just, they rely on precedent. The legal system is based on consistency and about case law and about predictability. Science is always changing. Every time we accumulate new information, we change or alter or revise our theories based on the acquisition of knowledge. And so these two things kind of collide and they can be contradictory. And so what we saw in Judge Coleman's opinion is exactly what we'd expect in a legal analysis, which is citing case law, citing precedent, citing what other courts have said. There's another kind of important point, I think, that both of these decisions turn on. And that's here in the US, we have two standards that judges are supposed to look at when deciding whether expert testimony is legitimate. One's called the Frye standard, one's called the Daubert standard. They're named after cases. But for the purposes of this discussion, both of these standards have one very important criteria, which is that if somebody is challenging expert testimony, a judge is supposed to ask, is this testimony accepted within the relevant scientific community? And as it turns out, how a judge defines the relevant scientific community basically predicts how a case is going to turn out. So what we found is that if you limit the relevant scientific community when you're trying to assess the legitimacy of an area of forensics, if you limit the community to people who already practice that area of forensics, they're almost always going to rule that it's a legitimate form of expertise. And this makes sense, right? If these people make their living in this particular area and you're asking whether the entire field is legitimate, they're all going to say yes. The example I like to give is that if you are assessing the scientific legitimacy of tarot card reading or palm reading, but you only consult people who read tarot cards or who do palm readings to get your opinions, you're probably going to decide that those fields are legitimate, right? Because those are the only opinions you're getting. If you expand it beyond people who actually practice in this field of forensics and start talking to scientists, people from the scientific community, when you start talking to cognitive scientists, people who study cognitive bias, people who put exams together, proficiency tests, then, those people will start to look at these fields and say, okay, well, are we testing these people? Are the tests legitimate? Are they real black box tests that, assess the way that these people kind of do their jobs every day in the forensics lab? And so for fields like forensic firearms analysis, what these tests have shown is that they're actually not very good at matching bullets to guns, particularly in a way that excludes, every other gun except one. When they have been tested, they haven't done particularly well. They have, sort of administered their own tests to one another that aren't particularly rigorous. But when it's a legitimate sort of black box test, they have yet to prove that they can do this, in a way that we should be comfortable with, given that their analysis can send people to prison. So as you might expect then, so Judge Hooks, in his opinion, considered, the scientific community to be well beyond people who merely practice forensics firearms analysis. So people who already do this for a living. He considered, a broad array of people from the scientific community who have been criticizing the way that forensic firearms analysis is done. Judge Coleman, in her opinion, limited the relevant scientific community only to other people who do forensic firearms analysis. And that really, I think, explains the discrepancy between the two decisions better than anything.
But if the standard legal analysis is just wrong, where does that leave us? At some point in time, defense attorneys are going to keep running that argument against a judge who eventually is going to buy it, and they're going to find against forensics and set a precedent, aren't they?
You'd think, but one area that I've been writing about for 20 years now is bite marks. And, there's just no scientific evidence whatsoever to support the proposition that you can match an alleged bite on human skin to one person's teeth to the exclusion of all other people, on Earth. There's just there's so many problems with that. It's not clear that we all have unique dentition or that we all have a unique bite. It's also not clear that skin is capable of recording and preserving in a bite that makes it, able to be matched. There's also no evidence that bite mark analysts are very good at matching one bite to one set of human teeth. And so far, every scientific body to, try to test any of these theories have found that all of them are completely lacking in any sort of scientific research or evidence. And what evidence we do have cuts against them. It says they aren't true. And yet, to this day, every single court in the US that has considered a challenge to bite mark evidence has rejected the challenge and upheld the evidence as legitimate, or upheld the expert testimony as legitimate. And, I think this cuts to a very core kind of fundamental problem with the criminal justice system here in the US. And I think, in a lot of countries, which is that it doesn't like to admit its mistakes. And the bigger and more profound and more consequential the mistakes, the harder it is to get the justice system to admit them. So, if you take a judge like, Judge Coleman or really any judge, if you want them to say that forensic firearms analysis is not a legitimate science-based form of analysis or expertise, they are basically having to admit that the criminal justice system not only has failed to keep this particular type of evidence out of these criminal cases, but out of hundreds of criminal cases every single day. And that means that, that also requires them to admit that the system by which evidence is admitted or not admitted is also broken. And that is such a fundamental part of our criminal legal system that, that would also require them to basically admit that the system is fundamentally flawed. So, you're asking a judge in one of these cases to say, this entire system, that you went to law school for, that you trained for, that you spent your entire career in, that a lot of your identity is sort of grounded and centered in, it's fundamentally flawed to the point where, it may be sending innocent people to prison without, any sort of recourse. And I think that's a really, really difficult thing to get a judge to be willing to admit or concede. And so, I think it takes a judge that has a bit of an edge or has a bit of a chip on his or her shoulder, like Judge Hooks, to be able to kind of consider that sort of ruling. And unfortunately, in this case, Judge Hooks came with some other baggage that eventually rendered his opinion moot, I guess. It was basically vacated.
Okay, so how much of a problem is there with the quality of evidence in American criminal justice? How many cases are we talking about here being compromised, and what can be done about it if it can't be fixed through the courts?
Yeah, so it's hard, it's hard to say how bad the damage is, and that's in part because every time we have one of these scandals, there's this effort to kind of limit the damage. So, when DNA came along, that was an opportunity. Like I said, that should have been a wake-up call. It should have been a red flag, telling us that we need to do a better job of deciding what evidence is and isn't scientifically legitimate. It should have prompted a lot of soul searching and testing. And instead, what happened is it did a lot of that within the small subset of cases for which DNA is dispositive of guilt. So, going forward, for the most part, if there's a case where DNA, that turns on DNA testing, I think you're much less likely to be wrongly convicted, than you were before we got DNA testing. But the problem is whatever set of problems were exposed by DNA testing also almost certainly exist in the wider pool of cases for which DNA, has no real significant influence. And we haven't done anything about those cases. Just testing DNA, what we should have done is said any case where DNA evidence overturned a verdict and proved that an innocent person was convicted, we need to look at everything that contributed to that conviction, right? Because every single witness in that case, scientific forensic witness, eyewitness, jailhouse snitch evidence, every single contribution to that conviction was wrong. And so all of those need to be evaluated. And instead, what we did is we just said, well, we're going to start testing DNA going forward, and that'll be that. And what that means is that all these flaws outside of that subset of cases are going to continue. They're going to continue to corrupt cases. They're going to continue to put, innocent people in prison. Now, obviously, I don't think that every single case that involves forensic firearms testing was a wrongful conviction, right? I think a lot of those people were probably guilty. I think probably a high percentage of them were guilty. So you can't, we can't just say that all of these cases are wrongful convictions. We can say that all these cases, were corrupted, and that, they should at least be revisited. And that's one small area of forensics. So, it's difficult to say. I think a very high percentage of criminal convictions in the United States over the last half century were probably corrupted in some way. That doesn't mean all those people were innocent. It doesn't even mean, a majority or a significant percentage of them. But even if it's just, 1 to 5% of people who are convicted were actually innocent, you're talking about tens of thousands of people who are innocent, who were sent to prison or possibly even executed. And so, I think at the very minimum, we need to come up with a better way of evaluating what sorts of expertise we let in these cases and what effect that expertise and that sort of testimony has on juries.
Radley Balko, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Now, I think that was a really interesting interview in itself, but I had more questions about this case and about the issue of forensics, and I also had a whole lot of other questions in general that I wanted to hear about from Radley. So I talked to him for about another hour, and I'm going to play that to you now. One disclaimer though, I know there was a jump cut in the middle of the interview. We're not cutting out any content in PEEP, but my wife walked in halfway through the interview, and so I cut all that out. And I then closed the door so she wouldn't walk in the interview anymore. So that's why there's that jump cut. But anyway, enjoy. Thanks so much, Radley, for joining us for a lot more. First of all, I got some extra questions about the forensics issue before we move on to more general criminal justice issues. First of all, how much of a problem do you think, it sounds like a joke, but I'm kind of serious. How much of a problem do you think CSI Miami is to this whole issue? Like, have cop shows polluted not just our minds, but the minds of our judges?
Yeah. I think, I think the complaint you hear about the CSI franchise in general is more from, a lot of times from prosecutors, because they think that those shows have kind of sort of conditioned jurors to expect a lot more out of forensics than it's capable of delivering. But, I do think it does mean that when you do get somebody on the stand who is willing to give jurors the kind of certainty that they crave to say, this and only this person could have done this, or, I put this shoe in my, forensics machine and, somehow it found dirt that could only have come from this person's backyard. Jurors are ready to believe that because of the kind of the programming that they've seen on television. So I think it's definitely had an effect. I think there's still some research being done on trying to figure out just what that effect is.
Yeah. In our TV interview, you rightly said, let's just skip past a lot of what Judge Hooks talked about because we can go into incredible detail because it's TV and people don't have the attention span for that. But this is a podcast now, so why don't we go into some of that detail? What do you find? What do you think? What stands out to you as the most interesting elements of the evidence that Judge Hooks found is dodgy about forensics?
Yeah, I think the stuff that I find really kind of interesting is, the analysts in these fields called pattern matching or tool mark identification. Basically, all they're doing is eyeballing it, right? They're looking at, for example, scrapes on a door, and they're comparing them to scrapes they make on a similar door with a screwdriver, found in the suspect's garage, right? And they're trying to say only this screwdriver could have created these marks. And, whether you're talking about bite marks or bullets or hair or carpet fiber or shoe prints or tire tracks, there's no computer that's sort of going through and algorithmically, sort of combining these patterns and saying, this is a match or this isn't. Now you do get that with some forms of fingerprint analysis now. But in most of these other cases, it's just an analyst looking through a microscope or looking at two computer screens and comparing these two things and saying, yeah, that looks like a match to me, or no, that doesn't. And it's, it's based on what they say is their experience and training. But they can't really say for sure, right? They can't say that only this screwdriver was capable of making these marks because we haven't tried every screwdriver against every surface, from every possible angle to be able to say that. So, we don't know that all human dentition is unique. We don't know that everybody leaves a unique bite mark when they bite into, a piece of cheese or human skin or anything else. So it's all just kind of, matching things up. And so the best way to say whether these fields are legitimate or not is to test them. And, if you think that you can match a bullet to a gun to the exclusion of all other guns, and let's give you, a series of tests. Let's give you bullets and let's give you two sets of bullets, and you tell me whether they're fired from the same gun or from different guns, and we'll see how well you do on those tests. And for a long time, people in these fields were very, very reluctant to subject themselves to any kind of testing. And when finally, the scientific bodies started coming down hard on them, they started giving themselves their own tests, but they weren't particularly rigorous, as I said in the TV interview. So to give you one example, in the Winfield case, the expert for the state talked about one test that he had put together and gave firearms analysts. And as the defense points out in its brief, they gave that test to people in their own office, in the public defender's office. These are people who had no expertise in firearms, or these are lawyers and paralegals, right? And they all passed the test easily, right? So that, the very point of expertise is you're supposed to be giving the jury information that the jury doesn't already possess themselves. And if random people in this public defender's office can pass this test, then that by definition is not expertise, right? So even after that, finally, the FBI and some people in the forensics firearms community finally gave a somewhat more legitimate test, right? This is a test that was a little bit more rigorous. The problem, well, two problems. One is the way that you would test an analyst in a way that really kind of evaluates whether or not, day to day, that they're not implicating innocent people or acquitting guilty people, is you should slip these tests, these proficiency tests, in with their day-to-day work, so they don't know when they're being tested or not. And there's a lab that actually does this in Houston, and I've interviewed the head of that lab, and what he does is he concocts these tests and he puts them in with their day-to-day work. And in fact, he gives them little bonuses like a Starbucks gift card if they can spot which cases are test cases in which are real cases that they can, because he wants to disguise them. And what he found is they have very high error rates on these test cases, and so that has been a factor in what he allows those analysts to say on the witness stand. But that's really one of the only labs that does it. So the problem with this FBI test is that, one, the way they chose the test takers, and then the other problem is with the way they scored it. So they didn't administer these tests, try to put them in with these analysts' daily work. They asked for volunteers to come and take this test in a testing environment, right? So as soon as you know you're being tested, you're going to change the way you do your analysis, right? Because you're being watched, you're being evaluated, and the incentives change, right? Because if you're working at a crime lab where police and prosecutors are pressuring you to come up with implications or to implicate a suspect, and that happens in a lot of crime labs around the country, that is going to affect, even if you're a conscientious analyst, that implicit sort of pressure is always going to be there. Whereas when you're taking a test, and you're being measured on how well or how proficient you are at doing these forms of analysis, you are going to be trying to do your absolute best. The incentive is to get everything right? It's not to necessarily please, a supervisor or police or prosecutors. Then you look at the way the tests were scored. So when an analyst is given, a bullet or two sets of bullets, they have three options. They can either include the suspect bullet, which means, this is a match, or this gun could have fired this bullet. Exclude it, this gun is incapable of firing this bullet. Or say there's, insufficient data to say either way. What they did on this test was, if you answered insufficient data on any of the answers, it was scored as correct. So, if your incentive is to not get anything wrong, as opposed to implicate someone, and you're taking this test, you're going to answer insufficient data for any question that you have any doubt about whatsoever, which is not going to necessarily be the case in the crime lab. And so by scoring it that way, they managed to produce a very, very low margin for error. And when analysts outside of the field looked at these tests, they said, all right, hold on, wait a minute. This is not the way that this is done every day. And if we score, if we look at the insufficient data and look at them in a way that an analyst in a lab would look at that question, the error rate gets much, much higher. And in fact, what they found is that, one, they answered insufficient data at a much higher rate than we see in everyday crime labs. And two, they're much, much more likely to say insufficient data on questions that should have been exclusions, which means they should have exonerated the suspect as opposed to inclusions. And so, the take from that is that they're probably more likely to say that they can't say either way when they should be excluding people, when they should be exonerating people. And the really interesting thing I learned when I was reporting on this is that, I think I certainly thought this, and I think most people think that a crime lab is balanced, right? That they're just searching for the truth and they're just searching for justice. And so every time that they are given a piece of evidence, they are, as likely to exonerate someone as they are to implicate them, depending on what the tests say, right? What their analysis says. And what I found is that the Illinois Crime Lab, and in fact, this is the case at a lot of crime labs around the country, they will only either implicate someone or say there's insufficient data. As a matter of policy, they will not exclude someone. They will not exonerate anyone. And that was kind of mind-blowing to me, because that means, a prosecutor has nothing to lose by sending evidence to a crime lab. Either they're going to get evidence that, makes their case a slam dunk, or the analyst is just going to say, I can't say either way, and they can proceed with their case without bothering to call the analyst. And what we found if you look at old convictions in which somebody was exonerated by DNA, and you go back and you look at the testimony that the crime lab analyst gave on the witness stand, over and over again, you'll hear them say something to the effect of, I couldn't say either way, or the tests were inconclusive. And when people have gone back and re-examined those tests or looked at the data again, they found that they should have been exclusions. And so it became this idea of insufficient data became a way for an analyst to sort of not railroad a prosecution's case but also not necessarily lie in the witness stand, right? They're just saying, I can't say, who knows, right? When they should have been excluding people. So, that was, and for a judge like Hooks to get that far into the weeds, to like not just sort of take the state's test results at face value, but to look beyond that and say, well, how are these tests scored? How were they given? How were the test takers chosen? I mean, that is an in-depth scientific analysis that we would expect from, in a scientific journal, a peer-reviewed journal, something from the National Academies of Sciences. So that's, I found it was very impressive to see that from a judge, and for somebody who's been writing about these issues for a long time, it's kind of, mind-blowing to see a judge perform that level of scientific analysis. And then, of course, it made it all the more, deflating to see that opinion vacated a few months later when that judge retired.
Does his finding have any precedential view whatsoever, or is it just completely struck from the record?
So even at the time it was published, it really only had precedential value in that court in Chicago. So this was a circuit court. So this is the kind of the very first level of criminal court in the state of Illinois. So it really didn't, the value that it had was, the analysis was detailed and thorough enough that, other defense attorneys around the country could start citing to it. They could, and now here was a judge, it didn't have precedential value in that it didn't bind any other courts, but it was something that other courts could cite and say, okay, and start building a record, for this type of analysis and this type of scrutiny. So now that it's been vacated, I think even that very sort of minimal value that it had, and, I don't mean to understate it. I mean, it was a very significant ruling, but, that's gone now too. So.
Okay, well, I imagine most of the people listening to this are probably wondering, what happened to Judge Hooks? Like, we just brushed over it. We probably should back over that a bit, because to be fair, so why don't you tell me why Judge Hooks was disappeared?
Yeah, so Judge Hooks clearly had a temper. He had been disciplined for scolding a fellow judge because he thought she was going too easy on police officers who were lying on the witness stand. He had also been criticized for reprimanding prosecutors. There's a famous case in Chicago where police had been torturing people into false confessions in the 1980s under the direction of a guy named John Burge. And so in some of those trials of those officers, Judge Hooks presided over the criminal trials in those cases. And he, at some point, lashed out at the prosecutors and said they were acting more like defense attorneys for the police in those cases than prosecutors. So he was criticized for that too. So he's always been a bit of a bomb thrower. He's clearly has a bit of a temper. He was, he's kind of clearly seen as, temperamental. And so, I don't mean to understate what he did to get himself removed from the bench. I don't know. I wasn't there. I can't say whether it's accurate or not, but, there are very serious allegations. And so the allegation was that he had a case involving a defendant who was of Arab ancestry, and I think his attorney was too. And the allegation is that in a closed door session, in his chambers, that he made some pretty disparaging remarks about Arab men and sort of made sweeping accusations that Arab men, I think, like they beat women or beat their wives, made some comment about how he had killed a lot of Arab men when he was in the military. So this comes from a defense attorney, this allegation. It came out, he was removed from that case and temporarily suspended. And then the prosecutors, who also were allegedly in his chambers for that, then alleged that he had called them up and tried to get them to vouch for him or to support his denial that he had made those claims in the complaint, the misconduct complaint against him. And that's a pretty bright line in the legal system. If there's a complaint against you being litigated, you don't try to influence witnesses outside of a court proceeding. And so that was really kind of what forced him into retirement. I think it speaks to his judgment on it. Obviously, I think it speaks to his temperament. I don't think it necessarily invalidates every opinion he's ever written, or I don't think it undermines the the scholarship or the persuasiveness of the opinion he wrote in this particular case. Unfortunately, the timing of it means that, this opinion was still subject to this motion to reconsider at the time all of this happened. And so when he was then forced into retirement, his replacement was able to reconsider this opinion. His replacement, by the way, is a former prosecutor, and a recent former prosecutor. You can make what you will of that. But I do think, people who rise to the bench from a prosecutor's office tend to look at these issues a little bit differently than people who, have a criminal defense or civil liberties background.
Okay.
We like to think it doesn't matter, but, it's the real world, right?
Yeah, it is. Okay, let's go general now on crime issues. Trump just won an election, at least partly, because Americans were so concerned about rising crime rates. Should they be worried?
Should they be worried about Trump? Absolutely.
No, about crime rates.
Right. No. So yeah, crime has been dropping the last year and a half in the U.S. Pretty significantly. Trump was lying about rising crime. He was lying about it in 2016, also when he was elected the first time. In fact, Trump is the first. I did the math on this a while back. I think he's the first president in 30 years to leave with a higher homicide rate than he entered office. And in fact, he inherited the lowest homicide rate from Obama that any president had inherited since like the 1930s. So, he was lying about crime then. He was lying about crime in 2024. He was lying about immigrants and how much crime they commit. He lied about it all. I mean, ironically, maybe not ironically actually, but I think his policies are going to be worse for crime for a number of reasons. One, there's some, I think, persuasive evidence showing that violent crime and homicide in particular tend to go up in the United States when there's a lot of political turmoil, when there's a lot of division, when people see the government as illegitimate, particularly people in marginalized communities. If there's one thing we saw the first time around with Trump, it was that there was a lot of division, there was a lot of civil unrest, there was a lot of people in marginalized communities thinking the government is illegitimate. So we're going to see all of that again. But also his immigration policy in particular, I think is going to make it more difficult to fight crime for several reasons. One, we also saw this during his first administration, is that when the government cracks down on immigration, immigrants, both documented and undocumented, are less likely to cooperate with the police. They're less likely to come forward to report crimes because they're afraid of the police. I think we will see less cooperation from those communities, particularly if Trump, as he says, he starts trying to recruit local sheriffs and local police to start doing immigration enforcement. That's going to make those communities much, much, much less likely to cooperate with police, to talk to police, to be witnesses in criminal cases, because they want to get, deported. They don't want their family members to be deported. The other thing he's doing that I think has kind of flown a little bit under the radar here, he did this the first time around too. So the Obama administration had prioritized deporting people who had violent criminal records. Like that's where they put most of the resources for deportations. Trump immediately repealed that policy and put an emphasis on deporting asylum seekers. Now, as somebody who thinks that people who are seeking political asylum, from persecution, deserve a safe haven, and that the United States should be that safe haven. I find that policy, repugnant, morally and on every other level. But just from a practical standpoint, you're literally deprioritizing going after violent, people who have violent criminal records in order to spend more resources on going after people who are seeking political asylum. That is, you're deliberately diverting resources away from violent crime toward people who haven't committed any crime and are just, want to come here and be safe and live their lives and raise their families. That to me is, if I were a tough on crime kind of person, I would be pretty appalled by that. He also instructed in one of his executive orders, he instructed the Attorney General, the head of the Justice Department, to prioritize going after people who are undocumented, even people who have not committed any crimes, to prioritize that above terrorism, above organized crime, above drug smuggling, human trafficking. I mean, this is putting the desire to be cruel to immigrants, making that your top priority over all of these other issues that are actually about keeping the public safe. I can't even begin. I mean, it's like, it is prioritizing cruelty over public safety, and it's appalling. And I don't know what to. I don't know. There's a lot about this administration that you can just shake your head, and that's about all you can do at this point.
Yeah, I'm going to be reading that executive order that you're referring to there on next week's podcast. I've been doing the research on this, and just to skip ahead to next week a little bit, for those who are wondering about exactly what Radley's referring to there about the ins and outs of it, it's not just that he's giving exactly the same priority to anyone who's there illegally, regardless of whether they're a criminal, not a criminal, terrorist, whatever. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. They treat them all the same. The problem with this is that there are only so many people they can deport. They only have so many flights. There's only so much funding. You have to keep them somewhere. There's only so many positions in detention while they're waiting to be deported. And so if you don't prioritize anyone, whether you like it or not, you can only take a certain number of tens of thousands of them at a time. And if what you're taking is a whole bunch of just nobodies, you by definition have to leave the criminals and the terrorists and all the rest of it that you're not prioritizing. So it's bizarre. But anyway, we'll talk more about that next week. On general crime rates, there is an argument that gets used. You hear this on Fox News a bit, that that reliable source, that people aren't reporting crime anymore because of the leftist DAs who are going to let them off without a slap on the wrist, with just a slap on the wrist. So the crime numbers aren't reliable because less people are reporting crime than otherwise would have or used to. What do you make of that?
There's not much to it. I mean, there are several rebuttals to that. First of all, crime went up in 20 and 21 around the entire country. It went up in blue states and red states, and went up in cities with progressive DAs and traditional DAs and law and order DAs. It went up everywhere. And then starting in 2022, it went down everywhere. I don't think that Joe Biden is, responsible for or should be thanked for the crime rate coming down. I think presidents have very little effect on crime other than what we've already talked about. I think it was the result of the pandemic. I think there are lots of ways that the pandemic upended day-to-day life. I think it disrupted black markets for drugs and guns and other things, which created turf wars. There were no witnesses for a long time on the street, which made it easier to kill somebody and get away with it. So the fact that crime went up everywhere and then down everywhere, makes me think that we can probably trust these numbers. But there are a couple of other reasons why I think we should trust them. One is, you can talk about not reporting, say, have shoplifting or having your car stolen. Well, actually, no, let me take that back. Shoplifting, you could say, oh, well, they're just not reporting anymore because it's not going to be investigated, right? Same if somebody breaks into your house. Car thefts, actually, people do tend to report because they need it for their insurance, right? So that tends to be pretty accurate. But homicides, you can't really hide a body, right? I mean, you can't downgrade a homicide to a theft, right? If somebody's dead, then that's going to be in the crime statistics. And homicides have risen and fallen generally with the rest of the crime rates. And so I think that's a good reason to think that we can trust, the data that we've seen. The other thing is there are two ways that we measure crime. One is the FBI uniform crime reports, which come from police departments themselves. And those are crimes that get reported to the police. The other way is there's this, I can't remember the full name of it, but there's a survey that the Justice Department does. It's a phone and in-person survey where they ask people if you've been victimized by a crime in the last year.
That's the NBRS, yeah.
The NBRS, that's right. And that data, tends to show that the FBI statistics understate crime, but what we haven't seen is evidence that from the NBRS that we should be skeptical of the idea that crime is falling. The NBRS has shown that crime has fallen overall as well, including, it shows that there's more crime than the FBI does, but that the trends tend to be largely the same, with a couple of weird exceptions that I think go back to the way data was collected and how it was collected during the pandemic. But generally speaking, both of these show that crime has been dropping over the last year, and basically since 2022.
Okay. Before we talk more about the incoming administration, let's talk about the outgoing administration for a second. Can you assess Joe Biden's legacy when it comes to criminal justice? He obviously started off quite poorly when you look at his crime bills in the 1990s and late 1980s. But the last 4 years, how would you assess his legacy, at least in the criminal justice realm?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Joe Biden is a politician. I think he's been kind of a weather vane over the years. He's kind of, gone with wherever the public has gone. So he was very tough on crime in the 80s and 90s. He was good on a couple of issues. There's a law we have here called EDPA that makes it very difficult for people to challenge their convictions in federal court. And he actually warned about, at the time back in the 90s that would be a problematic law and it would lead to innocent people not being able to get their convictions overturned. But for the most part, he was pretty bad, pretty hardcore law and order, very, very much a drug warrior throughout the 80s and 90s. I think when he was elected in 2020, it was on the heels of the George Floyd protest. There was a lot of social, racial justice activism and change going on that he, kind of hitched his campaign to. In terms of what he actually did, I think he did some good stuff on marijuana. He, he issued more pardons and commutations than any president in modern times, although almost all that came in the last couple of weeks of his administration. And he also commuted, 90% of the federal death row, which is a pretty significant thing, not something no president has ever done before. So I think he gets credit for all of those things. He didn't really, I don't think criminal justice reform was ever really a priority for his administration. It wasn't something that they pushed. I don't think he did any damage. He didn't make things worse, which, isn't something you can say out of a lot of presidents, frankly. So that in itself, maybe, I guess, is a victory. But, I think mostly kind of a middling legacy. He did a few good things, but mostly, just kind of didn't do a whole lot. I will say, they deserve credit for at the federal level. They during the pandemic, they moved to have a lot of federal people sent home who weren't, didn't pose much of a risk. And that also showed and demonstrated that those people didn't need to be in prison in the first place, right? If you could just send them home and nothing happened, then why were they in prison, at all? But yeah, I think generally, I think he did not make up for all the damage he did earlier in his career, but he didn't make things worse as president. So
sure. Okay, let's move to Trump. You've already flagged that you might not be the biggest Trump fan. He obviously had the First Step Act in his first term. Did you rate that at all, and did it give you any hopes for a potential second term with Trump?
No, I mean, look, I think he deserves credit for it. It is a significant piece of legislation. It has made a huge difference in the number of lives of federal prisoners and their families. And it was an achievement. It was an accomplishment. Now, Trump has said he immediately regretted signing it, almost, at the point he signed it. His Justice Department tried to unfund it to make sure that it wouldn't be nearly as effective as it could have been. But despite their best intentions, it ended up working. And it was something that, he could later then point to when he was accused of, being racist or being, overly draconian on criminal justice policy. But, at the same time, he's, trying to claim credit for the First Step Act. He's saying that drug dealers should be executed, right? He wants to expand the death penalty, beyond crimes that involve someone actually being killed. after Biden commuted the death sentences of 37 federal death row inmates, Trump put out this executive order basically saying that, they should have, I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but that they should be, miserable and they should be kept in the worst conditions possible because they're horrible human beings. That's not his exact wording, but something to that effect. And his entire life and career has just been this idea of, he's kind of this, cranky old rich white guy who complains about crime all the time. To this day, he hasn't apologized to the Central Park Five for, taking out a full page ad in the newspaper calling for their execution when they were innocent. They've since been exonerated. So I don't expect, I expect only bad things from this administration when it comes to criminal justice. I think just how bad it would get, I don't know. I'm worried about this Justice Department. I'm worried about it going after journalists. I'm worried about it going after critics, free speech. I think that things are going to get, pretty grim here before they get better.
In the executive orders so far, you referred to a few of them already. Is there anything you haven't mentioned so far that you particularly liked or disliked from a criminal justice point of view?
There's so much. I guess so far at least, I don't think he's. Oh no, well he did say that they were gonna. He just issued one. Oh well, I guess it was a Justice Department directive saying we're going to start criminally investigating police and prosecutors at the local level who don't cooperate with this deportations. So that's pretty frightening because that's never been done before. And immigration enforcement is a federal issue. It's in the Constitution. Criminal justice has long been a very local issue. Policy is mostly decided at the local level. When the federal government has gotten involved, it's been generally through grants, and tying favored policies to grants. And so they're going to try to lean on that heavily by threatening to withhold funding from so-called sanctuary cities that, provide a haven for immigrants. The federal courts were split on that the first time around. And by the time it got to the Supreme Court, Biden had defeated Trump. And so the court kind of dropped it. So I'm sure we'll see that come back to the court about whether the administration can blackmail local jurisdictions into complying with deportations. But some of the things that Stephen Miller has proposed, and these aren't in executive orders yet, but Miller is Trump's sort of czar on immigration, and he has suggested things like activating the National Guard in a Trump supporting state and sending them into a blue state to carry out deportations. Well, what's going to happen there? Will the Democratic governor of that state then activate his own National Guard to protect immigrants in that state? Are we going to have a case where we have opposing National Guard troops pulling guns on each other? What happens if, ICE does not have the authority to go into a home to arrest someone? What happens if they start doing that? What happens if neighbors, which we've seen, including in my home city here in Nashville, Tennessee, where neighbors have formed a human chain around an immigrant's home to stop them from being deported? Is Trump going to order National Guard troops to start shooting people for doing that, for sticking up for their neighbors? These are pretty profound questions. And he's made it clear that he adores strongmen. He particularly adores strongmen who crack down on protests, who crack heads. He, according to multiple aides from his first administration, he repeatedly expressed a desire to have troops shoot protesters. So I don't know. I'm worried about where things may be going. I'm worried about how bad it could get, and I guess it depends on sort of what we're willing to tolerate here.
I'm going to go into much more detail on the next podcast about this, as I said, when I go through the executive orders. But speaking for myself, I'm very interested to see what the Supreme Court is going to say about some of the directions he's going in with immigration in particular. As you say, there's a lot of unfinished business from the first term. Remain in Mexico was unfinished business. They just dropped the case halfway through. The national emergency of immigration is they kind of dropped that halfway through as well, the court case. So there's a little bit of unfinished business, and he's upped the game as well by declaring it an invasion. And
which is really open-ended, and he can make it last the invasion last as long as he wants. border crossings are actually down dramatically over the last year, but that doesn't matter.
Yeah, yeah. Well, depending on how you count them, whether you count the people who use the app and made appointments or not, if you don't count the people who came orderly, who didn't cross the border in a dubious way, who actually went through the proper process to cross the border and apply for asylum, if you don't count them, Biden actually has fewer crossings at the end of his administration than Trump had at the end of his administration, which is
and that just
hasn't been publicized.
And that just goes to show you that, people want to come here lawfully and peacefully. They want to come here to work. There are employers who want to employ them because our economy runs on immigration. I mean, that's the thing, right wingers don't want to admit. So if you provide an easy way for people to come here legally, that's the route that they're going to take. People don't want to risk their lives. They don't want to cross the Rio Grande, putting their kids and their own lives at risk. They don't want to be walking through the desert and, risking dying of thirst. If there's an easy, orderly way to do it, that's how people will come here. And then, you can, but that's the thing. I mean, the Trump administration, Stephen Miller, they don't want to end illegal immigration. They want to end immigration. If you look at the policies that are in Project 2025, it's not about militarizing the border and building up the border and deporting all the undocumented people. It's about ending immigration. I mean, they want to end the H-1B visa program, which is, high-skilled immigrants, but, we also need low-skilled immigrants. They want to end the visas that we give to farm workers, to migrant farm workers to be able to work seasonally here. They want to end that program too. They want to cut off aid to colleges and universities that allow immigrant students to come over here. I mean, they want, as Trump said, they want more immigrants from places like Norway and Switzerland. What does he mean by that, I wonder, right? It's clearly they want more white people in this country and less brown people.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the pardons. Because there's obviously been some controversial pardons recently. So once again, let's start with Biden, then let's move to Trump.
Right.
Let's start with Joe Biden's preemptive pardons for his family members and allies like Fauci, Milley. What do you think of those?
I think that they were just like with his son. I think they didn't look good. I also think they were probably necessary. I mean, Trump was openly promising to, target Biden and his family. I mean, his aides have been, licking their chops at the prospect of going after political opponents. He himself said he wanted to go after the January 6th committee and put them in prison. I think it was necessary. I don't think it looked good, but I also think it was. I would have done the same thing, I guess, if I were in Biden's position. Here we are.
Yeah. Are you concerned about the precedent value, or do you think, look, Trump was going to do, we'll pardon whoever he wants to pardon anyway, regardless of whatever Joe Biden did?
Yeah, I don't buy that this set a bad precedent. Trump set a bad precedent. I mean, first of all, political pardons have been going around, have been part of the process forever. But, Trump set the precedent very, very early on in his administration when he pardoned Joe Arpaio, the sheriff in Arizona, who was accused of all kinds of civil rights violations. And, that sent a message that, like, this is the kind of, behavior that Trump thinks is worthy of a pardon. And then, he pardoned Steve Bannon, he pardoned all sorts of his, white collar buddies who had been convicted on various corruption charges. He pardoned, Jared Kushner's dad. Yeah, and he was openly promising to pardon the January 6 people well before Biden, pardoned his own son. So Trump was always going to do that. I don't think what Biden did had anything to do with it at all.
Did you have a view about the Leonard Peltier pardon? About there seem to be two views on that one. What's your view?
So I'm not. I'm familiar with kind of the basics of the case. I know that I think that it seems like whatever sort of criminal culpability he had was not commensurate with the sentence he got and the charges he got. So, I think a pardon was overdue. From what I understand, he has not been, a problem in prison. And, I think there's a very persuasive case that he was unjustly convicted. So, yeah, I think it was, I think we need more use of the pardon in those types of cases where it's used as sort of a last check on injustice. Instead, I think the way the pardon and clemency power is typically used is either for political patronage or as kind of a way of a president or a governor to sort of uh, officially forgive someone who admits that they're guilty. And to me, I think there's room for forgiveness and redemption. Certainly in the criminal justice system, I believe in that. But I think we don't see the pardon used often enough as a sort of last check against injustice. I think that's how it was used in Peltier's case. So I think it's a good use of it in there.
Okay, let's move to Trump's pardons. Obviously, the J6 prisoners loom large when we're talking about these. First of all, do you hold concerns for the treatment of any of the January 6 prisoners? Were you okay with people being hauled through lengthy court cases for misdemeanors like disorderly conduct or trespassing? Like, we're talking the 55% of the J6 cases that don't involve violence against police, don't involve thugs, vandalism, just people who shuffled around like Brown's cows through the corridors. Were you comfortable with the way they were treated or not?
I think I've seen a few examples where I think they were overcharged. I think I think context matters here. I mean, they were part of an effort to subvert American democracy. So I think the Justice Department, was trying to send a message. They were going to be very thorough in their investigation and how they charge people. That said, I think definitely there were a few cases where the Justice Department went too far. I also completely agree with them when they say that they were, those who, I think most of them were actually given bail, or bond, but I think most of them, the few that weren't, or those who couldn't make it, were held in the DC County Jail, and a lot of them complained about the conditions in that jail, and they're absolutely right. I mean, most jails in the United States are dank, decrepit, horrible places. I mean, there's a reason why we see so many jail suicides, because including for people who are held on very minor misdemeanor or even traffic offenses. It's a place that's like, I wouldn't want to be held there for a single night. It's horrible. That said, the people who are worried about the conditions that they were being held at in the DC County Jail, 95% of those people had never expressed any concern about the jail conditions before all of that, which, this is what we've seen over and over again when Trump and his people get involved in the criminal justice system. It's like a lot of people discover for the first time, how unfair and unjust the system actually is, because it's happening to them. But, I do know that the DC Federal Public Defender's Office, pulled out all the stops to make sure that these people got a robust defense. Probably, went to greater efforts than they do in their everyday cases, just because they probably knew everybody was watching and there would be a lot of scrutiny. And, as for the violent people, the people who were violent, I think I've seen a few sentences that probably seemed a little bit excessive to me, but the people who were planning to violently overthrow the government, I take that pretty personally. I mean, this is my government, this is my country, these are my voting rights that they were trying to, I don't know what you would say, neutralize or take away. So yeah, I mean, I think Trump's pardoning of them, even the ones who maybe were overcharged and treated unfairly, that's not what it was about. I mean, he's calling them patriots. He's calling even the violent ones patriots. He's making it very clear that people who engage in political violence on his behalf, are going to get a literal get out of jail free card. And we've seen this across the right. I mean, I wrote about Texas Governor Greg Abbott pardoning, I want to say Daniel Penny, but there are two right-wing Penny cases that the right wing was fired up about. This is a case where a guy went to a Black Lives Matter protest armed, had texted friends saying, I'm going to go kill someone at the protest tonight, and then went and shot and killed a protester. And he was convicted for killing that protester, and Texas Governor Abbott pardoned him at the insistence of people like Tucker Carlson. And it was such an egregious uh, example of just sort of licensing right-wing violence. And that to me is pretty scary. I mean, I'm very worried about Trump sending, federal troops door to door to round up immigrants. I think that's a huge worry and fear. And if he can assemble this giant deportation army, like I worry how he might use it next. But I really think the bigger threat is this idea that he has these militias and he has these kind of soldiers out there who are willing to go out and commit violence on his behalf. And he's basically signaled to them that under his administration, they're going to be able to get away with it. Now we have other checks. We have local prosecutors, local police, but it's not it's not a good thing to have these kind of militia types think that they now have sort of carte blanche to commit violence on behalf of the president.
Yeah, yeah. I think you make a good point there that even if they can be arrested, as you say, crime is local. You can be arrested by state or local authorities. There's plenty of crimes you can break on a local level. If they think they are immune,
right,
then that's the problem. That doesn't matter if they're actually immune or not. If they think they're immune, that will affect their conduct.
Well, and if you're in a red state and you go into a blue city and commit a bunch of political violence, in Trump's name, you can be charged by the local prosecutor, but the Trump supporting governor can then pardon you, like Abbott did in Texas. So they've been sent a message that this kind of violence is now tolerated on the right, and I think that's a pretty scary precedent.
What would you say? Let's forget Trump, forget Biden, forget politics. Generally speaking, what are the biggest criminal justice issues facing America right now, in your view?
Oh, man. I mean, before the election, I would have given you a very different answer that I'd give you right now, because everything is Trump related at this point. But, I do think, we have a crisis in public defense in this country. It's actually what I'm writing a book about it right now. But public defenders are perpetually underfunded and understaffed, which means that people, aren't getting an adequate defense. And, I think the criminal justice system generally is not a system that seeks to rehabilitate or reform people. It's a system that just kind of wears people down and grinds them down, and makes them more likely for recidivism than less likely. I think that's a huge and massive problem that we're just not equipped to deal with right now. I think the move toward reform-oriented prosecutors has generally been a good thing. I do think there's been the inevitable backlash, and so I think it'll be interesting and very consequential to see how that plays out, to see if they can kind of survive this initial backlash. I think the fact that crime rates have been dropping dramatically over the last 2 years. And during that period, there's no reason to think that there are fewer progressive prosecutors than there were before. And in cities that have progressive prosecutors, crime has also dropped. So I don't think you can tie, a rise in crime to progressive policies. I don't think there's much evidence for that at all. So I hope that movement survives, because I think it's a more kind of holistic and productive approach to the criminal justice system. It's this idea that we need to rehabilitate people. It shouldn't just be for punishment. Obviously, there are some people who are inherently dangerous, but a lot of times that dangerousness is created by the system. You go in as a kid, as a juvenile, for something pretty minor, and by the time you get out in your mid-20s, you've been kind of hardened by the system, and so you're a lot more dangerous than when you went in. I don't know. I mean, EDPA has always been my kind of pet issue, and that's this law that makes it really difficult to get your conviction reviewed in federal court. And Supreme Court has moved more and more in that direction. So in other words, they made it more and more difficult for people to get into federal court. And the idea is that, we can trust the states to do a good job and to protect people's constitutional rights and to guard for wrongful convictions. And there's just no evidence that the states deserve that kind of deference. So I think we need more federal review of state convictions, not less. And I think, unfortunately, the courts are moving in the other direction.
So could you go into more detail on that, on the EDPA, because people aren't going to know what you're talking about. So can you just go about how they're making it hard to get to federal court?
So it's called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. It was passed in 1996 after the Oklahoma City bombing, although the law really had very little to do with it in the end. Basically, for a long time, people on the right had been saying, oh, people on death row, they file these frivolous lawsuits or frivolous appeals to, just buy time. And so they live, on death row and on the taxpayer dime, and it takes 25 years to execute them. And to some extent, they had a point, just in that it was taking a long time to execute people. And the reason why is not because of frivolous appeals. The reason why is because the states were so eager to execute people that they were basically taking constitutional shortcuts. And, so they weren't providing them with adequate counsel. They weren't providing them with their own experts. They were giving improper, unconstitutional jury instructions. And so over and over again, these states were getting shot down in federal court because they just weren't providing adequate constitutional protections, which are especially important when you're going to take somebody's life, right? And so the states responded, or I should say the right responded by trying to limit the federal court's ability to review state convictions. And so they passed this law in 1996 that basically, the way I've tried to characterize it in a way that kind of people can understand is the idea was that there are way too many appeals of these cases, of these federal convictions in state court. People are trying to appeal to the federal courts. And the argument was that, the federal courts are just overwhelmed, so we have to cut down the number of cases, right? But EDPA doesn't cut down the number of cases based on merit, right? Because you can't do that, because in order to reduce the number of cases, if you're going to say the federal court should only hear meritorious claims and not these frivolous claims, well, somebody has to decide which claims are frivolous and which claims are meritorious, right? So there's no shortcut around that. So what they did instead was they just created all these arbitrary rules that you had to follow, and if you didn't follow the rules, the court wouldn't even consider the merits of your case. You get what they call a procedural bar. They would just throw your case out without even looking at it. And that's now how most of these cases are dismissed. And so the way I've likened it is, let's say you run a publishing company and you decide you want to publish, 40 books next year. And so you put out a call for manuscripts, right? But you get like 1,000 manuscripts, right? Way more than you have editors to read, so you're overwhelmed and you need to cut down how many manuscripts your editors actually consider. And so instead of like having somebody look through them and only pass on the most, meritorious or publishable manuscripts, you just say, we're not going to consider any manuscripts that are in this particular font, right? Or we're not going to consider any manuscripts that are, have the page number at the top instead of the bottom. It was just these really dumb, arbitrary deadlines and rules and regulations. And, it resulted in a lot of innocent people unable to get into federal court to get their cases reviewed. And part of the problem was, the same time EDPA was passed, all the states were also rebelling against the federal courts and appeals by passing their own mini EDPAs. And so in a lot of these states, the state legislature made it impossible to even get into state court to get your conviction reviewed. And then the federal courts are saying, well, we're just going to trust the states because they know what they're doing. And meanwhile, the states are saying, we're going to defund public defense. We're going to, a lot of states had these offices just for death penalty cases that were much better funded and had better trained and experienced lawyers than in the traditional public defender's office, and they only handled death penalty cases. And they were very good. They won a lot in court because, because the states were doing such a rush job to get people, to the electric chair. But because they were doing so good, it pissed off a lot of legislatures, and so they defunded those offices. That's how they dealt with this. So we're now in a place where, by the way, all this is happening at about the same time that DNA was showing us that a lot of innocent people were being sent to prison, right? At the same time, science comes along and shows we're putting the wrong people in prison. Congress and these state legislatures are making it more difficult for innocent people to get into federal court and to have their cases open. And, since then, the Supreme Court has just, it's only strengthened EDPA, and they've only made it more and more difficult to get the federal courts to review state cases. So, it's a very complicated law. And that's by design too. There's only a handful of attorneys in the country that truly understand it, which makes it even more difficult, because if you can't get a lawyer, to take your case, you're probably going to get rejected on procedural grounds because you're a prisoner and you don't know how to write a legal brief that complies with it. But anybody who works in sort of post-conviction law or innocence cases will tell you that it is the bane of their existence. It is, it is a manifestly unjust law that needs to be revisited. And, I actually had some hope at the beginning of the Biden administration that he might look at it, because, like I said, that was one of the few issues in the 90s that he actually warned about. Like, he said, this law is going to be bad and it's going to stop innocent people from getting their cases reopened. And I kind of hope that his administration might make a push on it. But, I think they were scared to death of looking, weak on crime or whatever. So it never really became an issue, unfortunately.
Do you have any off the top of your head examples of the ridiculous rules in ADMA?
Sure, I can give you one really poignant, I think, example that I wrote about. It was actually the first story I wrote after I left the Washington Post and put on my Substack. There's a guy in Arkansas named Charlie Vaughn, and Charlie was convicted in the late 80s, along with two other people, for murdering and sexually assaulting this elderly woman in Arkansas. And Charlie actually confessed and implicated, he's convicted with three other people and implicated the other three people. But Charlie also had severe capacity issues. He was mentally ill. He was intellectually disabled pretty severely. And basically would later say that his defense attorney, who, by the way, got paid $300 to handle his murder case, $300 total, basically said his defense attorney told him his only hope of avoiding the electric chair was to plead guilty and implicate the other people. And so Charlie gets convicted, and the other three get convicted too. Fast forward about 20 years, and the Innocence Project takes on his case. They take on the case of two of his co-defendants, so two of the four people, and find significant evidence that they're innocent. And they go to federal court. And, EDPA makes it very, very difficult, but they just barely win, right? They find enough evidence, including a confession by the fourth guy that he committed the murder and did it alone, and that he didn't even know all of these other people who were convicted. In fact, he said at one point that he considered confessing before the trial, but when he saw that these other three people had been accused with him, he thought, these prosecutors have no idea what they're doing. I'm just going to take my chances here. I could end up getting acquitted, along with all of them, because he knew they didn't do it. So he ends up confessing and says he did it alone. And so the other two co-defendants of Charlie's get, Innocence Project help, and they get their convictions overturned. They get exonerated and freed. Charlie's still in prison. And the main reason he's in prison is because in 1994, he couldn't find anybody to represent him. So he sent this very sad handwritten letter, and actually Charlie's illiterate. It was a cellmate who wrote it, to a federal court that basically tried to appeal his conviction. Now, that was the right thing to do. I mean, the other people kind of let the deadline pass without appealing their convictions. But they couldn't get attorneys either. That's why. But Charlie, at least sort of knew that he had to do something. And so he filed this appeal. And of course, it was rejected, perfunctorily by the federal court. But the problem is that the EDPA gets passed. And under EDPA, you get one crack at a post-conviction appeal. And so because Charlie had sent that letter to the federal court, he had taken his shot at his appeal. The others missed their deadline, but that's an easier sort of hurdle to get her over than filing an appeal that gets denied. And so Charlie, despite the fact that he was convicted on exactly the same evidence as the other two, despite the fact the other two are now free, one of them has since passed away, Charlie is still, sitting in a maximum security prison in Arkansas. And he's been there for over 30 years now. And it's one of the worst, sort of most haunting cases I think I've ever written about, but it is because of EDPA that he's still there, and because of that sad letter that he sent in 1994.
This is a bit of a random question as we approach the end, but it just occurred to me. You're obviously quite progressive. That's, I think, obvious to all our listeners. How do you feel about Neil Gorsuch, who's not at all progressive? He's extremely conservative, but as much as a Supreme Court justice cares about these kinds of issues, he's the one. What's your view on him?
He's a mixed bag. I mean, he has surprised. I mean, I come from kind of a libertarianish background, and I identify less and less with the right because of the Trump era. I think has just made them all crazy. And yeah, I'm definitely a civil libertarian on these issues. Gorsuch is good on issues, some procedural issues, some Fourth Amendment issues. He's actually not very good on the issues we've been talking about, these wrongful conviction cases. He's very much an EDPA kind of stalwart. He doesn't like the federal government reviewing states' decisions at all. But he's been good on like Native American rights, Native American issues, Fourth Amendment issues. I think, with the exception of Alito and Thomas, I think all the other justices have at times shown, some tendency to occasionally rule on behalf of, people accused of crimes. Obviously, I think Sotomayor and Jackson are the two best on these issues. But yeah, I think Gorsuch is probably a distant third, and then probably Kagan after him. Roberts is generally pretty bad. He can occasionally surprise you. Kavanaugh wrote the decision on non-unanimous juries, striking down death sentences from non-unanimous juries. He then wrote the same decision, also wrote the opinion that refused to make it retroactive, which was a little strange because he wrote this impassioned defense of unanimous jury decisions and talked about the racial history and but then decided that it wasn't so compelling that he was going to let people who had already been wrongly imprisoned by that rule, challenge their convictions, which was a little strange to me. But, so yeah, I think with the exception of Alito and Thomas, they all can be surprising every now and then. But I think generally speaking, Sotomayor and Brown Jackson are the two, who are most consistently on the right side of, the rights of the accused.
Radley, thank you so much for all your time. You've been very generous. Sure. Obviously people can find you on your Substack, The Watch. Yep. What is there anywhere else where people can find out more about you and read more of your stuff?
No, it's just radleybalko.substack.com. I'm also on Blue Sky. Got a couple of books out, one on policing and one on some of the forensics issues that we were talking about. But yeah, Substack is the main place to find me. So
fantastic. Radley, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So that was Radley Balko. If you want more, go to radleybalko.substack.com, and that was PEEP193 Planet Extra. They're not normally going to be this long. This is our first one back. There's so much to catch up on, and we all know how much we haven't talked about when it comes to Trump's first week. That's all going next week, plus whatever Trump comes up with next week. So PEEP next week's going to be pretty long as well, and hopefully we'll have caught up. Do tell me what you think of making the pod this way, with a main pod and then an extras pod. We're just experimenting here, so I'd love to know what you think about it. And also let me know what you think about releasing them at the same time. And I will be seeing you guys next week with our big Trump executive order special. Until then, stay peppy.